The billionaire CEO mocked the janitor's daughter with a $100 million bet. He expected humiliation and laughter, but when she actually fixed it, he froze, and in that moment, everything changed. In the heart of Boston's Innovation District, behind the reinforced walls of a quantum computing lab, the future of artificial intelligence was collapsing. The Atlas quantum processor, a machine designed to revolutionize everything from climate modeling to disease prediction, couldn't maintain coherence for more than 7 seconds. Anderson Blake, the billionaire behind it all, was running out of time. First, he lashed out at his team of world-class engineers. 8 weeks. His voice echoed through the sterile facility. $30 million in emergency consultations, and you geniuses have nothing. His engineers stood in defeated silence. Then, with a predator's instinct, he turned on the janitor mopping in the corner. In front of everyone, he mocked her, daring her to fix the impossible machine for $100 million. Maybe the cleaning lady has the answer. Fix it, and I'll give you $100 million. She stood frozen, humiliated. And just as nervous laughter began to ripple through the room, a clear voice cut through the tension. My mom can't, but I can. The quantum processor was screaming a secret, but only the teenager could hear it. Its core was a maze of superconducting circuits and electromagnetic fields, a puzzle that had defeated the brightest minds money could hire. To them, it was an engineering failure. To her, it was a pattern waiting to be seen. The Atlas quantum processor was supposed to be Anderson Blake's masterpiece. It sat on an elevated platform in the center of Blake Quantum Technologies Innovation Lab, a space that felt more like a cathedral than a research facility. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Boston skyline, natural light glinting off the processor's polished titanium casing. The air was cold, kept at precisely 62 degrees, and smelled of liquid nitrogen and desperation. For 8 agonizing weeks, this machine had been the sole focus of the most expensive engineering talent in the country. It was more than technology. It was a promise of computational power that could crack problems humanity had struggled with for decades. A device that could secure a $5 billion Pentagon contract and cement Blake Quantum Technologies as the most important company in the tech sector. It was also a $3 billion monument to failure. Anderson Blake, a man whose custom Tom Ford suits cost more than most people's cars, paced the gleaming white floor like a caged animal. At 48, he had the ice-blue eyes of a predator and a temper that could clear a boardroom in seconds. He had built a $12 billion empire from nothing. He had crushed competitors, dominated markets, and graced the covers of magazines that celebrated his ruthless genius. But he could not make this quantum processor run for more than 7 seconds. After that precise interval, it would destabilize, cascade into chaos, and collapse with a soft, damning beep. Every test produced the same result. Every diagnostic returned the same infuriating conclusion: quantum decoherence, cause unknown. His lead engineers, a team of PhDs from MIT, Stanford, and Cambridge, stood in a tight, exhausted cluster. Their faces were pale with sleeplessness. They hadn't seen their families in weeks. They had tried everything. They recalibrated the cryogenic cooling systems. They replaced every superconducting circuit. They rebuilt the entire qubit array from the ground up. They even brought in a quantum physicist from CERN who specialized in coherent stability. Nothing worked. The 7-second curse held fast. Another failure, Dr. Chun. Anderson's voice was dangerously quiet. It was always quietest before the storm. Dr. Richard Chun, a man with a PhD from Caltech and 15 years of quantum computing experience, swallowed hard. Sir, the decoherence pattern is unprecedented. It's not thermal noise, not electromagnetic interference. The feedback loop is instantaneous. We simply can't isolate the source. Anderson stopped pacing and turned to face him. He gestured at the silent processor with barely controlled fury. So what you're telling me, after 8 weeks and $30 million in overtime, is that you don't have a clue? It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. The engineers flinched. They were used to solving impossible problems, to bending quantum mechanics to their will. This silent machine was a monument to their collective failure. And Anderson Blake did not tolerate failure. We're exploring new diagnostic approaches, Dr. Chun began, but Anderson cut him off with a bitter laugh. New approaches? Are you going to consult a fortune teller next? Maybe we should sacrifice a chicken to the quantum gods. His voice rose, echoing off the high ceilings. This processor is the key to the Pentagon contract. I have generals calling me every day, and I have to tell them that my team of geniuses has been defeated by 7 seconds of quantum noise. He ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair, his carefully maintained composure cracking. His gaze swept the room, hunting for a target, and landed on a figure in the corner, almost invisible behind a bank of monitors. It was a woman in a dark blue janitorial uniform, quietly wiping down workstations. She moved with practiced invisibility, trying her best to fade into the furniture. Her name was Denise Walker. For 18 months, she had cleaned the laboratories at Blake Quantum Technologies. She was a ghost in this world of billion-dollar budgets and revolutionary science, emptying trash cans, mopping floors, listening to hushed technical conversations about things far beyond her understanding. She was a single mother. Her world was not one of quantum processors and defense contracts. It was a world of medical bills and double shifts, of a daughter's private school tuition and the relentless memory of a husband lost too soon. Marcus had been a physicist before the accident. Now she was a janitor, working nights for the overtime pay that kept Jasmine's education afloat. Anderson's frustration, finding no purchase on his expensive, useless engineers, needed a new outlet. His eyes narrowed on the cleaning woman. A cruel idea sparked in his mind, a way to humiliate his team by showing them how utterly they had failed. "You there." He pointed directly at Denise. "What's your name?" Denise froze, her hand hovering over a keyboard she'd been wiping. Every head in the room turned toward her. She felt 24 pairs of eyes burning into her, and her face flushed with sudden hot shame. "Denise, sir. Denise Walker." Anderson walked toward her slowly, deliberately. His expensive Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor like a countdown. He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to look up at him. "Denise. Tell me, Denise, what do you think of our little problem here?" She was confused, terrified. "Sir, the machine, I wouldn't. The quantum processor, Denise. Our $3 billion headache." His tone was mock-friendly, dripping with condescension. "You've been here every night. You've heard these geniuses talk themselves in circles. Surely you must have an opinion." He was mocking her, using her as a weapon to shame his engineers. The room shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared intervene. Denise's mind raced. She just wanted to finish her shift and get home to Jasmine. I wouldn't know anything about that, sir. I just clean." "Of course you do," Anderson said with a cold smile. "But let's pretend for a moment. Let's pretend you're not just a janitor. Let's pretend you have the answer." He turned to address his engineering team, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Maybe we've been overthinking this. Maybe we don't need PhDs and million-dollar equipment. Maybe all we need is a fresh perspective. What do you say, Dr. Chen? Should we let the cleaning lady have a try?" Dr. Chen looked at the floor, his face grim. A few younger engineers snickered nervously. The cruelty in the air was suffocating. Denise felt small, exposed, utterly powerless. She wanted the earth to swallow her whole. That's ridiculous, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. Harrison's smile widened. He was enjoying this. "Is it? I'll tell you what's ridiculous. Spending $30 million to learn nothing. At least your guess would be cheaper." He took another step closer, lowering his voice to a stage whisper that everyone could still hear. "I'll make you a deal, Denise. You're a simple woman. You probably have simple problems: rent, car payments, medical bills. I bet a little money would go a long way for you." He straightened up, his voice booming through the lab. "Here is my offer in front of all these witnesses. You fix this quantum processor, and I will give you $100 million. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The engineers stared in disbelief. It was theater, of course, a cruel, insane joke. The number was so absurd, so impossible, that it existed only to underscore her powerlessness. "Fix my machine, Denise," Anderson repeated, savoring every syllable. "And $100 million is yours. If you can't, you're fired. Not just from this lab, but from the entire company. And I'll make sure every cleaning service in Boston knows you're the woman who thought she could play quantum physicist." Denise's heart hammered against her ribs. Tears stung her eyes. She felt the crushing weight of her late husband's memory, her daughter's future, the medical bills still piling up 2 years after the accident. She couldn't speak. She could only stand there, trapped in this billionaire's sadistic game. I can't, she stammered. Of course you can't, Anderson said with a dismissive wave. Now get back to your work. At least you're competent at that. He turned his back on her, ready to unleash a fresh wave of fury on his engineers. The show was over. The point had been made. But then a clear, unwavering voice cut through the silence. My mom can't, but I can. Every head swiveled toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway was a teenage girl. She couldn't have been more than 16 years old. She had dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wore a worn St. Catherine's Academy uniform with a heavy backpack slung over one shoulder. Through the open zipper, the spine of an old physics textbook was visible, faded, well-loved, covered in handwritten notes. She had been waiting by the door to catch a ride home with her mother after math club. It was Jasmine Walker, Denise's daughter. She looked directly at Anderson Blake, her brown eyes steady and clear. There was no fear in them. There was only calm, unshakable certainty. The engineers stared, mouths agape. Anderson Blake turned around slowly, his expression shifting from irritation to pure astonishment. For a moment, the entire $3 billion laboratory was utterly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the cooling systems. Anderson stared at the girl. Then at Denise. Then back at the girl. Then he did something that shattered the fragile tension in the room. He threw his head back and laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was loud, booming, derisive, a sound that bounced off the cathedral ceilings and filled every corner of the space. Well, this just keeps getting better, he roared, wiping a tear from his eye. First the janitor, now her daughter. What is this, a comedy show? Tell me, kid, are you going to fix it with a science fair project? Jasmine took a step forward, completely undaunted by his mockery. Her young face was serious, focused. No, sir, she said, her voice quiet but crystal clear. I'm going to find the pattern you're missing. The laughter died in Anderson's throat. He looked at the girl's earnest expression, at her mother's terrified face, and at the stunned silence of his engineering team. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming, but his arrogance demanded fuel, and this was the most bizarre fuel he'd ever been offered. His cruel smile returned. You know what? He said, walking toward Jasmine. I accept. The offer stands. He turned to Dr. Chin. We have a new consultant. Same terms, $100 million if she succeeds. Termination for both of them if she fails. Anderson, please, Denise rushed forward, grabbing her daughter's arm. She's just a child. Don't. Too late, Anderson interrupted, his smile predatory. Your daughter accepted the challenge. He gestured to his engineers. Clear the workspace. Let's see what the janitor's daughter can do. What Anderson Blake didn't know, what no one in that lab except Denise understood, was that Jasmine Walker wasn't just any teenager. While other kids her age spent their time on social media and video games, Jasmine had spent the last 6 years consuming her late father's physics journals and teaching herself quantum mechanics from university textbooks. Marcus Walker had been gone for 2 years, but his lessons had never left her. And now, standing in front of a billion-dollar failure, she was about to prove that genius doesn't always come with a PhD. Sometimes it comes from a father who taught his daughter to see the patterns where others see only chaos. Now, before we dive fully into this story, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story reminds you that talent and determination can come from anywhere. Never underestimate anyone. Let's get back to the story. 6 years ago, their garage in Dorchester. The universe speaks in patterns, Jazz. You just have to learn the language. 10-year-old Jasmine sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, watching her father's hands move across a whiteboard covered in equations. Marcus Walker was a brilliant physicist who had chosen teaching at an underfunded public high school over lucrative corporate research positions. His colleagues thought he was crazy. His wife Denise understood. He wanted to plant seeds, not count gold. See this. Marcus pointed to a wave function. Most people see math. I want you to see poetry. Quantum mechanics isn't about numbers, it's about possibility. Every particle exists in multiple states until someone observes it. Reality isn't fixed, Jazz. It's a conversation. Their weekend ritual never varied. Saturday mornings at the Boston Public Library, Marcus checking out academic papers while Jasmine devoured books 3 grade levels above her own. Afternoons were spent in the garage, Marcus translating complex physics into metaphors a child could grasp. Evenings ended with pizza and thought experiments. If you were an electron, Jazz, where would you be right now? Everywhere and nowhere, Dad. Until you look. His laugh was warm, proud. That's my girl. Present day, the Innovation Lab. Jasmine approached the Atlas quantum processor with the same methodical observation her father had taught her. She didn't rush. She didn't touch anything. She simply looked, really looked, at the architecture before her. The engineers watched with a mixture of pity and barely concealed amusement. This was going to be a spectacular failure, and most of them felt sorry for the kid who didn't know better. But Dr. Chun watched differently. There was something in the way she moved, the way her eyes tracked across the processor's components with systematic precision. She wasn't gawking at expensive technology. She was reading it. "Can you run a diagnostic?" Jasmine asked quietly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "But I need to see the thermal mapping during coherence collapse." The room went quiet. Dr. Chen's eyebrows shot up. That was an unusually specific request, not the fumbling of someone out of their depth, but the targeted question of someone with a hypothesis. Anderson, still wearing his cruel smile, gestured magnanimously. "By all means. Give the girl her show." But something flickered behind his ice-blue eyes. Uncertainty. Dr. Chun moved to the control console. Initializing diagnostic sequence. Thermal overlay active. The Atlas quantum processor hummed to life. On the massive display screen, a 3-dimensional thermal map appeared, blues and greens showing the supercooled components, yellows and oranges indicating heat distribution during operation. Jasmine's eyes locked onto the screen with laser focus. 3 seconds. 4. 5. 6. 7. The processor collapsed right on schedule. But Jasmine wasn't watching the dramatic failure. She was watching a specific section of the thermal map, zones 3 and 7, where a barely perceptible asymmetry had flickered across the display. 2 years ago, a rainy November night. Marcus had been driving home from a guest lecture at Boston University. He was excited. He'd been talking to Jasmine on the phone about a breakthrough in quantum error correction he wanted to show her. "I'll be home in 20 minutes, sweetheart. Get the whiteboard ready." Those were his last words to her. A drunk driver crossed the median on Route 93. Marcus died instantly. The drunk driver walked away with a broken arm and a suspended license. The financial devastation that followed was swift and merciless. Marcus's life insurance barely covered the funeral and 2 years of Jasmine's private school tuition. Denise, who had been pursuing her MBA part-time, dropped out to take multiple jobs. The woman who had once managed marketing campaigns now cleaned laboratories at night, her dreams packed away with her husband's physics journals. But she had made one promise to Marcus's memory: Jasmine would finish her education. No matter what it cost. Present day. "Again please," Jasmine said, her voice steady. "But this time, show me the electromagnetic interference pattern across zones 3 and 7 simultaneously." Now the engineers exchanged glances. That wasn't a lucky guess. That was diagnostic thinking. Dr. Chen's fingers flew across the keyboard without waiting for Anderson's approval. He was leaning forward now, his mockery giving way to genuine curiosity. The test ran again. This time, Dr. Chun split the screen, thermal map on the left, electromagnetic field visualization on the right. The processor spooled up, its quantum states dancing in perfect superposition. And then Jasmine saw it. A ghost in the machine. In Zone 7, the electromagnetic shielding pulsed a fraction of a second behind Zone 3. It was microscopic, 0.003 milliseconds, maybe less, but it was there. And in the hypersensitive world of quantum computing, that tiny delay was catastrophic. "There," Jasmine breathed, pointing at the screen. "The EM shielding is asymmetric. Zones 3 and 7 are out of sync." Dr. Chun pulled up the shielding specifications, his face going pale as he cross-referenced the timing data. That's impossible. Our tolerances are within manufacturer specifications. There's no way a timing differential that small could. It can when you're dealing with quantum superposition, Jasmine interrupted gently, her father's words flowing through her as naturally as breathing. The sensitivity isn't linear. It's exponential. When Zone 7's shielding pulses late, it creates a microscopic interference pattern. That pattern interacts with the quantum states, creating a feedback loop. The loop compounds exponentially until the entire system collapses. She turned to face the room, and for a moment, she wasn't 16 anymore. She was Marcus Walker's daughter, carrying forward his gift for seeing the invisible. My dad used to say quantum systems are like houses of cards. The smallest breath can collapse everything. You're not looking at a hardware failure. You're looking at a timing cascade. The processor isn't broken. It's out of rhythm. The room went utterly silent. Even the engineers who had been smirking moments ago were now staring at the data on the screen, watching Dr. Chen's fingers trace the timing differential that their million-dollar diagnostic systems had missed. Anderson Blake's smirk had vanished completely. He stared at Jasmine, then at the screen, then back at Jasmine. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its mockery. It was the voice of a man confronting something he couldn't explain. How would you fix it? Jasmine met his gaze without flinching. In that moment, Denise saw her husband's quiet confidence reflected in their daughter's eyes, the same certainty Marcus had carried when he knew he was right, when he could see the pattern everyone else had missed. I'd recalibrate the EM pulse timing in Zone 7, Jasmine said. Delay it by 3 microseconds to synchronize with Zone 3. And then I'd add a buffer. A buffer. Senior engineer Marcus Hoffman scoffed from the back. Any additional circuitry would introduce more interference. Not a regular buffer, Jasmine said, turning to him with patient respect. A quantum buffer. A small auxiliary qubit array that mirrors the main system. It absorbs the microsecond fluctuations before they can cascade. It sacrifices itself to protect the primary computation. Dr. Chen's mouth fell open. That's quantum error correction applied to EM shielding itself, not just the qubits. He looked at his colleagues, his voice rising with excitement and disbelief. Why didn't we think of that? Jasmine's answer was simple, devastating. Because you were looking at the qubits. You should have been looking at what protects them. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Anderson Blake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, genuine uncertainty. Everything he believed about intelligence, credentials, and expertise was crumbling in real time, demolished by a teenager whose mother mopped his floors. How long to implement this? His voice was barely a whisper. Dr. Chun was already pulling up modification protocols, his fingers shaking slightly. 4 hours. Maybe 3 if we push. Anderson looked at Jasmine Walker, really looked at her for the first time. Not as a pawn in his cruel game, but as the variable that had just rewritten his equation. Do it, he said. The silence that followed Jasmine's diagnosis was the kind that precedes earthquakes, a suspended moment before everything shifts. Anderson Blake had given the command, do it. But before Dr. Chun could even open the implementation protocols, a voice cut through the stillness. Absolutely not. Marcus Hoffman, senior quantum engineer and 15-year veteran of the field, stepped forward from the back of the crowd. At 52, he had 3 PhDs, 2 patents to his name, and a reputation for being brilliantly difficult. His face was flushed with something between professional outrage and wounded pride. With all due respect, Mr. Blake, this is insanity. Hoffman's voice carried the weight of authority. You can't just add buffer circuits to a quantum system. Any additional circuitry introduces more electromagnetic interference, more noise, more potential points of failure. This isn't a car engine where you can slap on an extra part and hope it works. A murmur of agreement rippled through the engineering team. Jasmine could feel the shift in the room, the brief moment of wonder hardening back into skepticism. These were men and women who had dedicated their lives to mastering one of the most complex fields in physics. And now a teenager was proposing a solution that violated their most fundamental principles. The girl doesn't understand quantum computing, Dr. Saravas added, her tone gentler than Hoffman's but no less dismissive. Quantum states are fragile. The whole point of our design is minimal interference. Adding components, especially auxiliary qubits, would destabilize the entire array. She's talking about introducing more qubits into an already failing system, another engineer chimed in. That's like trying to fix a sinking ship by drilling more holes. Jasmine stood her ground, feeling the familiar weight of being underestimated. She'd felt it in physics club when she was the only girl. She'd felt it at academic competitions when judges saw her age before her work. She felt it now, magnified by billions of dollars and dozens of wounded egos. But Dr. Chun had gone quiet. Dangerously quiet. While his colleagues piled on their objections, he had pulled up something on his workstation, multiple windows cascading across his screens. His fingers moved rapidly, pulling up research papers, quantum error correction protocols, mathematical models. His eyes darted back and forth, reading, calculating, cross-referencing. The other engineers were still talking, their voices overlapping in a chorus of technical objections, when Dr. Chen suddenly said, "Stop." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were bright with something that looked like shock or revelation. "It's theoretically sound," Dr. Chen said quietly, his voice trembling slightly. He turned his monitor so the others could see. "Look. Quantum error correction using auxiliary qubits. We use this principle all the time for protecting quantum information. But we've always applied it to the computational qubits themselves. We've never thought to apply it to the electromagnetic shielding layer." He pulled up another diagram, his excitement building. The auxiliary array wouldn't interfere with the primary computation because it's not part of the computation. It's part of the protection system. It would absorb the microsecond timing fluctuations in the EM field before they could cascade into the quantum layer. Hoffman stepped closer, frowning at the screen. That's not how we've ever done error correction." "Exactly," Dr. Chen said, turning to look at Jasmine with something approaching awe. "That's why we didn't see it. We were looking at the qubits." "She's right, we should have been looking at what protects them." The admission sent a shockwave through the room. If Dr. Chun, their lead scientist, the man who had designed half the Atlas processor, was taking this seriously, then maybe, why didn't we think of that? Dr. Voss whispered, moving closer to examine Chen's screens. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice calm and clear. "Because you were trained to think about quantum computing in a specific way. You see the qubits as the system and everything else as support structure. But my dad taught me something different." She moved to the whiteboard mounted on the nearby wall, picking up a marker. As she drew, she could almost feel her father's presence beside her, guiding her hand the way he had in their garage all those years ago. In quantum mechanics, the observer affects the observed. But protection affects both. My dad used to say, function follows protection in quantum systems. If your protection layer is unstable, your function layer will inherit that instability, no matter how perfect the function layer is. She drew a simple diagram, concentric circles representing the quantum core, the EM shielding, and now a new outer layer. The auxiliary qubit array sits between the EM shielding and the primary qubits. It's entangled with both. When the EM field fluctuates, the auxiliary qubits collapse first. They sacrifice their coherence to maintain the primary system's coherence. It's like a quantum shock absorber. The engineers stared at the diagram. It was elegant, simple, and it made perfect sense. The recalibration of Zone 7's timing eliminates the source of the fluctuation, Jasmine continued. But quantum systems are never perfect. There will always be noise, always be tiny variations. The buffer doesn't eliminate noise, it absorbs it before it becomes catastrophic. It turns an exponential cascade into a linear damping function. Hoffman was quiet now, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "How do you know this will work?" Jasmine met his eyes. "I don't. Not with certainty. But the math is sound, and the principle is established. We're just applying it in a new context." It was the perfect answer, confident but honest. Not the arrogance of someone who thought they knew everything, but the certainty of someone who understood the limits of knowledge itself. Anderson Blake had been watching this exchange in silence, his mind churning through calculations that had nothing to do with quantum mechanics. Everything he had built his empire on was being challenged in real time. He had spent decades, and billions of dollars, hiring the best people. PhDs from the best schools. Experience at the best companies. Pedigrees that looked impressive in board presentations and investor meetings. And now a 16-year-old girl whose mother mopped his floors was solving a problem his elite team couldn't crack. Worse, she was doing it by pointing out their collective blind spot, the thing they were too educated, too experienced, too credentialed to see. The $100 million bet that had been theater, a cruel joke meant to humiliate, now felt terrifyingly real. He had witnesses. He had made the offer in front of his entire team and, he suddenly remembered with a cold jolt, Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Pentagon had been observing remotely via secure video feed. This wasn't just about his company anymore. This was about his word, his reputation, his entire identity as a man who played by rules he himself had written. Could he stop this now? Laugh it off, call it an interesting thought experiment, send the girl and her mother home? Yes. But at what cost? If Jasmine was right, and the look on Dr. Chen's face suggested she might be, then he would be walking away from the solution to save his ego. And if she was wrong? Then he'd spent an evening and some engineer overtime on a failed experiment. He'd wasted worse money on worse ideas. But it wasn't about the money. It was about control. It was about the comfortable world where he was the smartest person in the room, where his instincts were always right, where success came from following the established rules of hiring and hierarchy and credentials. Jasmine Walker was chaos, beautiful, terrifying chaos that his ordered world couldn't contain. Dr. Chun, Anderson heard himself say, his voice steadier than he felt. How long to implement this solution? Dr. Chin glanced at the clock. It was already past 7 p.m. 4 hours. Maybe 3 if we push and everything goes smoothly. Anderson looked around the room, saw the mixture of doubt and curiosity on his engineers' faces. He looked at Denise, standing frozen in the corner, her cleaning supplies forgotten, her face a mask of terror and hope. He looked at Jasmine, who stood by the whiteboard with quiet confidence, waiting for his decision. His pride screamed at him to stop this. His business sense whispered something different. Do it, Anderson commanded. Dr. Chen, you lead. Take Hoffman and Voss. Work with Jasmine. I want this implemented and tested before midnight. The implementation began with what Dr. Chun called surgical modifications. While 2 junior engineers carefully powered down the Atlas processor and opened the access panels to the EM shielding layer, Jasmine sat at a workstation with Dr. Chun, sketching out the auxiliary qubit array architecture in precise detail. The engineers had been initially patronizing. Dr. Voss actually started to explain what a qubit was before Jasmine quietly interrupted her. I understand. Superposition of 0 and 1 states, maintained through quantum entanglement and collapsed upon observation. The auxiliary array needs 7 qubits minimum to create sufficient entanglement with the primary system's 20-qubit core. Voss had blinked, nodded, and stopped explaining. As the work progressed, something remarkable happened. The engineers stopped treating Jasmine like a child playing dress-up and started treating her like a colleague. When Hoffman miscalculated the entanglement coefficient, Jasmine caught it. Dr. Hoffman, that's the formula for linear entanglement. For the EM buffer application, you need the nonlinear correction factor. It's in the Preskill paper from 2023. Hoffman had stared at her, then at his calculation, then back at her. You're right. He made the correction without another word. By 9 p.m., the initial fabrication of the auxiliary qubit array was complete, a delicate lattice of superconducting circuits no larger than a postage stamp but containing more precision engineering than most people would see in a lifetime. The real work was integrating it into the existing system without disrupting the primary quantum core. Denise watched from her corner, her cleaning cart abandoned. She had given up any pretense of working. Her eyes never left her daughter, 16 years old, exhausted from a full day of school and math club, now working alongside scientists twice and 3 times her age. She wanted to pull Jasmine away, to protect her from the crushing weight of this impossible expectation. But she also saw something else. Her daughter was exactly where she was meant to be. Marcus would have been so proud. Anderson Blake had not left. This in itself was unprecedented. He never stayed past 6 p.m. unless there was a board meeting or investor call. But tonight, he remained, watching from the observation platform above the main lab floor. He had ordered catering, gourmet sandwiches and coffee from a place in Back Bay that never closed. Another unprecedented gesture. Why are you really still here? Dr. Chun had asked him during a brief break, voice low enough that others couldn't hear. Anderson had been honest, which surprised him. I don't know. I should be angry. I should be worried about the contract, the board, the optics. But mostly, I'm curious. I want to see if I'm wrong. I want to see if everything I've built my empire on is actually. He trailed off. A comfortable lie. Dr. Chun had suggested gently. Anderson hadn't answered. By 10:30 p.m., Jasmine's exhaustion was showing. Her hands trembled slightly as she made notations. She'd been awake since 6 a.m., had taken a calculus exam that afternoon, led math club, and was now attempting to fix a $3 billion quantum computer. She was running on teenage resilience and sheer determination. Denise approached quietly, carrying a bottle of water. Jasmine, baby, you don't have to do this. We can leave right now. I'll find another job. Yes, I do, Mom. Jasmine's voice was soft but absolute. She looked up at her mother, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. For Dad. He spent his whole life teaching kids that anyone could understand the universe if someone just showed them how. Everyone told him he was wasting his talent, that he should work somewhere like this, she gestured at the gleaming lab, making money instead of making a difference. But he chose us. He chose his students. He chose meaning. She glanced at the quantum processor, then back at her mother. If I can do this, if I can show that genius doesn't need a pedigree, then everything Dad believed in was right. And maybe his life meant something. Denise pulled her daughter close, unable to speak through the tightness in her throat. From his observation platform, Anderson Blake overheard this exchange. He turned away, staring out at the Boston skyline, feeling something crack in his chest. The girl wasn't doing this for money or glory. She was doing it to honor a dead man who had chosen the exact opposite of everything Anderson represented. At 11:47 p.m., 3 hours and 47 minutes after they began, Dr. Chun closed the final access panel on the Atlas quantum processor and stepped back. Modifications complete. The team gathered around, exhaustion written on every face. Jasmine stood between Dr. Chen and her mother, swaying slightly with fatigue. Anderson descended from the observation platform, joining the group for the first time. Ready for final test, Dr. Chen announced, his hand hovering over the initialization sequence. Everyone looked at Jasmine. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered something that only Denise could hear, "Help me, Daddy." Then she opened her eyes and said, her voice clear and strong, "My dad used to say the universe rewards elegant solutions. Let's see if he was right." Dr. Chun pressed the button. The Atlas quantum processor hummed to life, and the world held its breath. The lab fell into a cathedral silence, broken only by the steady hum of the cryogenic cooling systems. 23 people had gathered around the Atlas quantum processor, every engineer who had worked late, every technician who had heard whispers of what was happening, even 2 security guards who had abandoned their posts to witness history. Or disaster. No one was quite sure which. The atmospheric pressure was suffocating. Careers hung in the balance. For the senior engineers, this was vindication or humiliation, their failure either solved by a child or compounded by wasted hours on a teenager's fantasy. For Dr. Chun, it was professional credibility on the line. He had vouched for Jasmine's approach, overriding colleagues with decades more experience. For Denise, it was everything: her job, her daughter's future, the weight of medical bills and broken dreams, and 2 years of barely holding on. And for Anderson Blake, it was something he couldn't yet name, a reckoning that went far deeper than money or contracts or quarterly earnings. Dr. Chun stood at the primary control console, his hand hovering over the initialization sequence. The holographic interface glowed softly in the dim lab, waiting for his command. He glanced at Jasmine, who stood to his right, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes clear and focused. For the first time all evening, Anderson Blake moved to stand beside Jasmine rather than above her or across from her. He didn't say anything. He simply took his place in the circle of witnesses, one more person waiting to see if the impossible could become real. Denise stepped forward and took her daughter's hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. Jasmine squeezed back. A silent communication passing between mother and daughter. "I love you. I'm scared. I'm here. We're together." Anderson's voice, when it came, was quiet but carried absolute authority. "Initialize." Dr. Chen's finger descended. The Atlas quantum processor came to life like a sleeping giant waking. First came the subsonic hum of the superconducting magnets energizing, a sound felt more than heard, a vibration in the chest, a pressure in the bones. Then the cryogenic chambers activated, visible through the transparent shielding as wisps of vapor that looked like trapped clouds. The temperature inside the quantum core dropped to a fraction of a degree above absolute zero, colder than the vacuum of space. The quantum array itself was beautiful in its activation, a lattice of superconducting circuits that began to glow with a soft ethereal blue light as electricity flowed through pathways narrower than a human hair. It looked less like a machine and more like a constellation coming to life, each qubit a tiny star in a manufactured universe. On the main display, data streams cascaded like waterfalls of light. Temperature readings, electromagnetic field strength, coherence measurements, entanglement coefficients, hundreds of variables updating in real time. And in the center of it all, a simple digital timer, counting up from 0. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The room held its collective breath. 4 seconds. 5. 6. Every engineer in the room knew what came next. They had seen it dozens of times, hundreds of tests. At 7 seconds, the quantum coherence would begin to destabilize. The carefully maintained superposition of quantum states would start to collapse. By 8 seconds, the cascade would be irreversible. By 9 seconds, the processor would shut down with that familiar damning beep. 7 seconds. The timer clicked over. The Atlas quantum processor continued to hum, steady and strong. 8 seconds. Someone gasped, a young engineer named Rodriguez who had spent 3 weeks replacing every single superconducting circuit, convinced the problem was hardware. His hand flew to his mouth. The curse was broken. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Oh my God, someone whispered. 30 seconds. The engineers began to murmur, their voices low and disbelieving. They leaned toward their monitoring stations, checking and rechecking their displays as if the data might be lying to them. But the numbers didn't lie. The quantum coherence was holding steady at 99.7%, better than the theoretical maximum they had designed for. 1 minute. Dr. Chen's voice cracked as he read the data stream aloud, his professional composure fracturing. Coherence holding at 99.7%. Thermal distribution optimal. EM shielding synchronized across all zones. Auxiliary buffer absorbing microsecond fluctuations exactly as predicted. He looked up from his screen, his eyes bright with tears. It's working. It's actually working. 2 minutes. Denise had started crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she gripped her daughter's hand. She wasn't looking at the processor or the data screens. She was looking at Jasmine, seeing her daughter's profile illuminated by the soft glow of the quantum array, and seeing Marcus in every line of her face. Our baby did this, she thought. Our little girl solved the unsolvable. You should be here to see this, Marcus. You should be here. 3 minutes. Marcus Hoffman stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. But slowly, almost against his will, his posture changed. His arms uncrossed. His rigid stance softened. He stepped closer to his monitoring station, pulled up a specific set of readings, and stared at them in something approaching religious awe. The auxiliary buffer is operating exactly as she described, he said, his voice barely audible. It's entangled with both the primary qubits and the EM shielding layer. When the field fluctuates, the buffer collapses first, sacrificing its coherence to protect the primary system. It's beautiful. 4 minutes. Dr. Saravas was checking and rechecking her calculations, her fingers flying across her tablet. Finally, she looked up and said simply she was right. About all of it. The timing asymmetry, the cascade mechanism, the buffer solution. A 16-year-old girl understood our quantum processor better than we did. 5 minutes. All quantum states stable, Dr. Chen announced, his voice stronger now, tinged with wonder. 0 decoherence. 0 drift. The processor is operating within optimal parameters. He paused, then added, this is the cleanest run we've ever had. Better than our best simulation. Jasmine stood very still, watching the data streams with focused intensity, but her eyes were distant. She wasn't thinking about the triumph or the money or the vindication. She was thinking about a garage in Dorchester, a whiteboard covered in equations, and her father's voice saying, that's my girl. She was thinking about how much she missed him. How much she wished he could be here to see this. How unfair it was that he had spent his life teaching others to see the beauty in physics, only to die before he could see his own daughter prove that everything he believed was true. I did it, Dad, she thought. Just like you taught me. I listened. I found the pattern. 10 minutes. The lab was no longer silent. Engineers were comparing notes, pulling up historical data, analyzing the buffer's performance with increasing excitement. Someone, Dr. Chun maybe, or one of the junior engineers, had pulled out a bottle of champagne that had been sitting in the break room refrigerator for 8 weeks, kept there optimistically for the day the processor finally worked. 15 minutes. It's working, Dr. Chun said again, his voice cracking with emotion. It's actually working. The cork popped. Champagne sprayed. The room erupted into celebration, engineers hugging each other, some crying, others laughing with the manic relief of people who had been carrying an impossible weight for too long. Rodriguez was jumping up and down like a child. Dr. Voss had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs of joy and exhausted relief. Even Hoffman was smiling, a rare genuine smile that transformed his usually stern face. But Anderson Blake remained frozen. He stood at the edge of the celebration, separate from it, his face drained of all color. While others cheered and embraced, he simply stared, first at the quantum processor humming with perfect stability, then at Jasmine, then back at the processor, as if his mind couldn't quite reconcile the two. His thoughts raced in a chaotic spiral. She did it. She actually did it. 8 weeks. 8 weeks of my best people, my most expensive talent, my hand-picked team of PhDs. And a 16-year-old janitor's daughter solved it in 4 hours. The $100 million. I said $100 million. In front of 23 witnesses. Dr. Chen heard it. Rodriguez heard it. Everyone heard it. And Colonel Martinez, oh God, Colonel Martinez was on the secure video feed. The Pentagon heard me make that promise. My board will crucify me. Victoria Chen will call an emergency meeting. The investors will demand explanations. The media, Jesus, the media. Billionaire CEO honors $100 million bet to teenage genius, or Blake pays janitor's daughter fortune after public humiliation. Either way, I'm the story. Either way, I'm exposed. But I said it. My word is my bond. That's what I've built my reputation on. Harold Chun believed in me 25 years ago because I was honest. Because I kept my promises. Because my word meant something. Can I walk it back? Call it hyperbole? Claim she's a minor and the contract isn't binding? Offer a settlement, $500,000, a college fund, a generous consulting fee? Yes. Yes, I could do all of that. My lawyers would find a way. They always do. But then what am I? Just another billionaire who makes promises to little people and breaks them when it's convenient. Just another rich man who uses his power to humiliate and his lawyers to escape consequences. Everything I believed. PhDs, pedigrees, credentials, the established order of who deserves success and who doesn't. She demolished it. She demolished it so completely that I can't even pretend anymore. I built a $12 billion empire on the belief that I hired the best, that success came from following the rules, that intelligence could be measured in degrees and years of experience. And she proved me wrong. She proved all of it wrong. Who am I, if everything I built my identity on is a lie? Dr. Chun approached cautiously, his face flushed with champagne and joy. Sir. His voice was gentle, but it cut through Anderson's spiraling thoughts like a knife. The contract, you said $100 million. Anderson raised his hand, a gesture that would have been commanding if his hand hadn't been trembling slightly. The celebration began to die down as people noticed. The champagne was lowered. The laughter faded. 23 pairs of eyes turned toward the billionaire who stood frozen at the center of his own lab. He couldn't form words. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. He looked at Jasmine, really looked at her, 16 years old, swaying with exhaustion, still holding her mother's hand. No triumph in her expression. No smugness or glee. Just quiet patience, and something that looked almost like compassion. Then he looked at Denise, whose face had transformed from joy to terror in an instant. She knew. She knew what was coming. Rich men didn't honor bets made to janitors' daughters. Rich men found ways to protect their wealth, their egos, their carefully constructed worlds. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable, then unbearable. The celebration had died completely now. Engineers exchanged nervous glances. Someone quietly set down their champagne glass. Anderson Blake opened his mouth again. I. The word came out as barely a whisper. He closed his mouth. His mind raced. Say something. Anything. Make this right. Make this go away. Take control. You're Anderson Blake. You built an empire. You don't let a 16-year-old girl destroy everything you've worked for. He opened his mouth a third time. And froze. The clock on the wall showed 1:47 a.m. The celebration had transformed into a wake. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the perfect, steady hum of the Atlas quantum processor, working flawlessly, singing its song of coherent quantum states and synchronized electromagnetic fields. A $3 billion machine finally doing what it was built to do, fixed by a girl who learned physics in a garage from a father who chose teaching over fortune. Anderson Blake, master of the universe, billionaire CEO, the man who had crushed competitors and bent markets to his will, stood paralyzed. He was a statue of his former self, all the arrogance and cruelty frozen in place, leaving only the hollow shell of a man confronting a truth too large to contain. Jasmine Walker looked at him with neither triumph nor fear. Just patient, infinite patience. She had seen this before, had seen it in her father when he waited for students to understand difficult concepts, refusing to rush them, giving them the space to arrive at truth in their own time. "What kind of man are you, Mr. Blake?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air like a quantum state itself, unresolved, suspended between possibilities, waiting for observation to collapse it into reality. In that frozen moment, Anderson Blake faced the most important decision of his life. Not about money. Not about business. But about the fundamental question Jasmine had asked. What kind of man are you? And he didn't know the answer. The first light of dawn crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Innovation Lab, painting the Boston skyline in shades of amber and rose. Anderson Blake sat alone in the observation room overlooking the main floor, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in his hand. He hadn't moved in hours. Below him, the Atlas quantum processor hummed with perfect stability, a technological miracle that had become his personal reckoning. It was 6 a.m. He had been sitting here for 4 hours, watching the readouts on the distant monitors, seeing the flawless coherence measurements tick by, minute after minute, proof that Jasmine Walker had done the impossible. At 2 a.m., he had finally managed to speak. Not much, just 5 words that felt like they'd been dragged up from somewhere deep and painful. "We'll discuss terms tomorrow." Then he'd sent Jasmine and Denise home in his personal car, with his driver, because even in his paralysis he couldn't send them out into the night to wait for an Uber. It was a small gesture, meaningless in the context of what he owed them, but it was all he could manage. Now tomorrow was today, and he still didn't know what to say. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen and felt his stomach drop. Victoria Chun, board chair. No relation to Dr. Richard Chun, though the coincidence of the surname had always amused him. There was nothing amusing about this call. He answered. "Victoria. Tell me the rumors aren't true." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the pre-dawn silence like a scalpel. Victoria Chun was 58 years old, a venture capitalist who had seen every possible way entrepreneurs could destroy themselves. She had little patience for stupidity. "Tell me you didn't actually offer someone $100 million in some kind of emotional breakdown." Anderson said nothing. The silence stretched. "Oh, for God's sake, Anderson." He could hear her moving, the rustle of papers, the click of a keyboard. She was already working. Victoria Chun always worked. "I've been getting texts since 3 a.m. Employees talking. Rumors spreading. Billionaire makes insane bet. Teen genius saves company. I need you to tell me exactly what happened." "The processor works," Anderson said quietly. "After 8 weeks of failure, it works. Perfectly. I don't care about the processor right now. I care about the $100 million you apparently promised to a teenager." "A janitor's daughter," Anderson corrected, though he wasn't sure why that detail mattered. "Worse." Victoria's sigh was heavy with implications. "I'm flying in from San Francisco. Emergency board meeting, 2 p.m. I'm calling everyone in. You have 8 hours to figure out how you're going to explain this, because I promise you, Anderson, they're going to eat you alive." The call ended. Anderson set the phone down carefully, as if it might explode. At 7 a.m., his attorney arrived. Gerald Strauss was a partner at one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, a man who specialized in making problems disappear for people wealthy enough to afford him. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Denise Walker's car. "Walk me through it," Gerald said without preamble, pulling out a legal pad. "Everything. Leave nothing out." Anderson recounted the previous night, the frustration, the cruel mockery, the $100 million offer made in front of witnesses. Jasmine's acceptance. The solution. The success. His frozen response. Gerald took notes in elegant shorthand, his face betraying nothing. When Anderson finished, the attorney was quiet for a long moment, tapping his pen against his pad. "Technically," Gerald finally said, "a minor can't enter into binding contracts without parental consent. We could argue that the offer was made to the mother, who declined, and the daughter's acceptance was invalid. We'd likely win that argument in court. But..." Anderson could hear the unspoken caveat. "But you'd win in court and lose everything else." Gerald leaned back in his chair. 23 witnesses. Employees who heard you make the offer and saw the result. By now, half of them have probably told their friends and family. This will leak, if it hasn't already. And when it does, you have two choices. You're either the billionaire who honored an impossible bet to a brilliant kid, or you're the billionaire who used legal technicalities to cheat a teenager out of money she earned. "She's 16, Anderson said, though he wasn't arguing. He was just speaking his thoughts aloud. "She solved a $3 billion problem in 4 hours. "Exactly. Which means this isn't about the law. It's about optics, reputation, and forgive me for saying this, your soul." Gerald closed his legal pad. "You'd win the legal battle. You'd lose everything else that matters." By 8 a.m., the media pressure was building like a storm surge. Anderson's PR director, Michelle Torres, called with barely controlled panic in her voice. "TechCrunch has a story. So does Wired. They're calling it Teen Genius Solves Blake's Quantum Computing Crisis. Someone leaked." Michelle was talking fast, the way she did when situations spiraled beyond her control. "We need a statement. The longer we wait, the worse the speculation gets. They're going to create a narrative, and if we don't get ahead of it..." "What narrative?" Anderson asked, though he already knew. "Right now? Inspirational. Teen girl, daughter of deceased physicist, solves impossible problem. But that can flip in a heartbeat if you don't honor the bet. Then it becomes, cruel billionaire humiliates working-class family, refuses to pay. We're talking social media firestorm. Boycotts. Investor pressure. This could tank the company, Anderson." "The processor works perfectly," Anderson said. "The Pentagon contract. Won't matter if you're a public relations nightmare. Colonel Martinez already called me." Michelle's voice dropped. She wanted to know if the rumors were true. She said, and I quote, "We're partnering with Blake Quantum Technologies' values, not just their technology." She's concerned about optics. Anderson closed his eyes. The Pentagon contract was worth $5 billion over 5 years. It was supposed to be signed by the end of the week, a formality after 8 weeks of the processor failing. Now it worked, but the contract itself hung in the balance, contingent not on the technology but on whether Anderson Blake was the kind of man the U.S. military wanted to do business with. At 9 a.m., his CFO Patricia Sellers arrived with financial projections. She spread them across his desk with the efficient brutality of someone who dealt in numbers, not emotions. $100 million, structured as a consulting fee, is tax-deductible, she said, running her finger down columns of figures. It's significant but not crippling. We have sufficient liquid assets. The board will hate it, it sets a precedent, shows what they'll call reckless leadership. Stock might dip 3 to 5% on the news. Analysts will question your judgment. But, Anderson asked, because there was always a but with Patricia. But the Pentagon contract is worth $5 billion. And the publicity, if handled correctly, could be incredibly valuable. Company that honors commitments, recognizes talent regardless of pedigree, believes in giving opportunities to brilliant young minds. That's a narrative worth more than $100 million in advertising. She paused. Assuming you actually honor it. And if I don't? Patricia's expression was cold, calculating. Then we fight lawsuits, weather media storms, probably lose the Pentagon contract, and spend years rebuilding a reputation built on my word is my bond. The financial cost of that scenario? Incalculable. But definitely more than $100 million. By 11 a.m., Anderson was alone in his office, the door locked, his phone silenced. He stood at the window overlooking Boston Harbor, watching container ships move like toys across the water, and forced himself to think about something he'd been avoiding for years, who he actually was beneath the suits and the money and the carefully constructed image. He had built his empire from nothing. First in his family to attend college. Worked 3 jobs at MIT, cafeteria, library, tutoring, to pay tuition his scholarships didn't cover. Slept 4 hours a night. Graduated top of his class. Every success earned through intelligence and relentless determination. But somewhere along the way, determination had curdled into ruthlessness. Intelligence had become cruelty. He had started to believe that because he had suffered to succeed, everyone else should suffer too. That credentials mattered more than capability. That pedigree was destiny. When had that happened? When had he stopped being the scrappy kid fighting for a chance and become the billionaire who mocked people for not having chances? A memory surfaced, unbidden and unwelcome. 25 years ago. Anderson was 23, freshly graduated from MIT with a business plan for quantum computing applications that was 15 years ahead of its time. He had meetings with 17 venture capital firms. 16 of them turned him down. Too young. Too risky. Too theoretical. The 17th meeting was with Harold Chun, a Chinese-American investor who had made his fortune in semiconductors and had a reputation for betting on unlikely founders. Harold's office was in a modest building in Cambridge, nothing like the gleaming towers Anderson would later work in. "Tell me why I should believe in you," Harold had said, his eyes sharp but kind. Anderson had given his pitch, the technology, the market opportunity, the projected returns. It was a good pitch. He'd practiced it 17 times. When he finished, Harold had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd said something Anderson never forgot. "I see something in you beyond the numbers, son. I see hunger, intelligence, drive. But I also see something else, something decent. Don't lose that as you climb. The higher you go, the easier it becomes to forget that other people are climbing too, from places you'll never have to see. Promise me you won't become that kind of man." Anderson had promised. Harold Chun had written him a check for $2 million. That investment made his first company possible. 5 years later, Harold's stake was worth $50 million. He'd sold it and retired. He died 5 years ago, at 78, surrounded by family. Anderson had spoken at his funeral. He'd said Harold Chun was the best man he'd ever known. He'd meant it. But he'd broken his promise. Now, standing in his office overlooking a city that represented everything he'd built, Anderson thought about Harold and felt shame burn through him like acid. What would Harold think of him now? The man who'd mocked a janitor in front of her co-workers? Who'd made a cruel bet designed only to humiliate? Who'd threatened a woman's livelihood for his own entertainment? Harold would be disgusted. And he'd be right to be. On his desk was a file his security director had compiled overnight. Everything they could find on Jasmine Walker and her family. Anderson had been avoiding it, but now he opened it, forcing himself to read. Marcus Walker. Ph.D. in Theoretical Physics from University of Michigan. Published 17 papers, 6 of them cited in Blake Quantum Technologies' own patent applications. Specialized in quantum error correction, the very field that had saved the Atlas processor. Chose teaching at an underfunded Boston public school over corporate research positions that would have paid 6 figures. Died 2 years ago in a car accident. Left behind a wife and daughter. Life insurance, $180,000, mostly spent on funeral costs and keeping Jasmine in private school. Anderson pulled up one of Marcus Walker's papers, cited in their quantum error correction protocols. It was brilliant, elegant mathematics that made complex concepts accessible. In the margins, someone on his engineering team had written, "Walker's approach is foundational. Build on this." They had built on it. Anderson's company had profited from Marcus Walker's ideas. And Marcus Walker had died in poverty, his widow cleaning labs at night, his daughter about to turn down MIT because they couldn't afford housing. The weight of this recognition crashed down on Anderson like a physical force. He had used this man's work to build a billion-dollar company. And then he had mocked the man's daughter, threatened her mother's job, made a cruel joke out of their lives. He pulled up Jasmine's file. Perfect grades. Captain of the math team. President of the physics club. Volunteer at the Boston Children's Science Museum, teaching elementary school kids about quantum mechanics using stuffed animals and metaphors. Full scholarship to MIT's PhD program in quantum physics pending. But the scholarship didn't cover housing, books, or living expenses. She'd have to decline. Unless. Anderson looked at the clock. 1:45 p.m. 15 minutes until the emergency board meeting. Victoria Chun would be there, along with 6 other board members, the people who had the power to remove him as CEO if they deemed him unfit. He gathered his papers, financial projections, legal analyses, the Marcus Walker file, and slid them into a leather portfolio. His decision had crystallized somewhere in the last few hours, though he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment. It wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. It was about who he wanted to be. It was about the promise he'd made to Harold Chin 25 years ago and broken somewhere along the way. It was about looking at himself in the mirror and recognizing the person staring back. He could fight this. Use his lawyers, his money, his power to minimize the damage and protect himself. He could offer a settlement, $500,000, maybe $1 million, structured as a consulting fee with an NDA. Most people would take it. Most people wouldn't have the resources to fight a man like Anderson Blake. But Jasmine Walker wasn't most people. She had solved a $3 billion problem in 4 hours using her dead father's lessons and her own brilliant mind. She had earned every penny of that $100 million bet, and more. And her father, Marcus Walker, had contributed ideas that made the Atlas processor possible. He deserved recognition Anderson had never given him. He deserved compensation his widow and daughter had never received. This wasn't about honoring a bet anymore. It was about paying a debt, financial, moral, spiritual, that was 2 years and 17 cited papers overdue. Anderson Blake stood, straightened his tie, and picked up his portfolio. He walked to his office door, paused with his hand on the handle, and took a deep breath. What kind of man are you? Jasmine's question from 4 hours ago echoed in his mind. He was about to find out. The boardroom on the 40th floor was exactly as he remembered, cold, modern, dominated by a massive table of polished black granite. 7 people sat waiting for him, Victoria Chun at the head of the table, flanked by Robert Thornton, venture capitalist and early investor Dr. Sarah Kim, quantum physicist and technical advisor, James Whitmore, former DoD official, Patricia Sellers, CFO, and 2 representatives from major institutional investors. They looked at him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. This was a trial, and Anderson Blake was the accused. Victoria gestured to an empty chair. Sit down, Anderson. Let's talk about how you nearly destroyed this company in one night. Anderson sat. He placed his portfolio on the table. And he prepared to fight, not against honoring the bet, but for the right to honor it the way it deserved to be honored. Before we begin, he said quietly, I want to show you something. He opened the portfolio and slid Marcus Walker's most cited paper across the table. This, Anderson said, is where we start. The boardroom felt like a gladiatorial arena dressed in modern corporate aesthetics. Black granite table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor, all the trappings of power and money. 7 board members sat arrayed like judges, and Anderson Blake was the defendant. Victoria Chun commanded the head of the table with the natural authority of someone who had built her career on making hard decisions. At 58, she had silver-streaked black hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that could dissect a balance sheet, or a man's soul, with equal precision. To her right sat Robert Thornton, the venture capitalist whose early $10 million investment had grown to a stake worth over $400 million. He looked like he was already calculating how much Anderson's stupidity might cost him. Dr. Sarah Kim, the board's technical advisor and a renowned quantum physicist in her own right, sat to Victoria's left, reviewing something on her tablet with focused intensity. James Whitmore, former deputy director of DARPA and the board's Pentagon connection, sat ramrod straight in his chair with the bearing of a man who'd spent 30 years in military service. Patricia Sellers, the CFO who'd given Anderson the financial analysis that morning, looked grimly prepared for battle. The two institutional investor representatives, Mark Delacroix from Vanguard and Liso Okonkwo from State Street, sat at the far end, their expressions neutral but attentive. Victoria didn't waste time on pleasantries. "Anderson, explain exactly what happened last night. Leave nothing out. We've heard rumors, but I want the full story from you." Anderson took a breath and recounted it all. The 8 weeks of failure. The $30 million in emergency consultations. His fury at the engineering team. His eyes landing on Denise Walker cleaning in the corner. The cruel idea that had sparked in his mind, use her to humiliate his engineers, to show them how utterly they'd failed. The $100 million offer made as theater, as mockery. Denise's humiliation. And then Jasmine's voice, "My mom can't, but I can." He described Jasmine's diagnosis, her unconventional solution, the 4 hours of implementation. The successful test. The processor running perfectly for the first time in 8 weeks. And his own paralysis, the frozen moment when he couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't decide who he was. The room was silent when he finished. Not the comfortable silence of people processing information, but the heavy silence of people witnessing a confession. Robert Thornton broke it first. "You offered $100 million to a child." His voice rose with each word. "Have you completely lost your mind, Anderson? This isn't some feel-good movie. This is a publicly traded company with fiduciary responsibilities." "We have shareholders," Patricia added, though Anderson knew she was playing her role. They discussed this that morning. "Board members have a legal obligation to those shareholders. Reckless promises made in emotional states. The Pentagon will see this as evidence of leadership instability," James Whitmore interjected, his military precision cutting through the rising voices. "Colonel Martinez has already expressed concerns. We're negotiating a $5 billion contract. We can't afford the appearance of chaos." Victoria raised her hand, and the room quieted. She looked at Anderson with something that might have been disappointment or might have been pity. "Our legal team has reviewed the situation. Technically, a minor cannot enter into binding contracts without parental or guardian consent." The mother declined. The daughter's acceptance, while dramatic, has no legal standing. Anderson felt his stomach tighten. "We can offer a settlement," Victoria continued, her tone pragmatic, almost kind. $500,000. Call it a college fund and consulting fee. We'll draft an NDA, spin the story as Blake Quantum Technologies mentoring young talent. The girl gets her education paid for, the mother gets financial security, we avoid legal exposure, and you come out looking generous rather than reckless." Around the table, heads nodded. It was the smart play. The business play. The play that protected everyone's interests and minimized damage. Anderson looked at the faces staring at him, waiting for him to accept the lifeline they'd thrown him. He thought about how easy it would be to say yes. To let the lawyers and PR people handle it. To go back to being the Anderson Blake who made calculated decisions based on risk assessment and return on investment. "Everything you're saying is correct," he said quietly. The room leaned forward slightly, sensing capitulation. "And everything is wrong." He opened his portfolio and slid Marcus Walker's most cited paper across the table toward Victoria. Then he pulled out 5 more, fanning them across the black granite like a hand of cards revealing the truth. "This man," Anderson said, pointing to Marcus Walker's name on the papers, was Jasmine Walker's father. He was a brilliant physicist who chose teaching at an underfunded public school over corporate research that would have paid 6 figures. He published 17 papers on quantum mechanics and quantum error correction. 6 of them, these 6, are cited in our own patent applications for the Atlas quantum processor. Dr. Sarah Kim had gone very still, her eyes moving from the papers to Anderson's face and back again. "Marcus Walker's theoretical work underlies our entire quantum architecture," Anderson continued. "Our engineering team built on his ideas. Our patents reference his research. We made billions," he gestured around the room. "All of us from this table made billions building on foundations he laid. And he died 2 years ago broke, leaving his widow to clean our labs at night and his daughter to figure out how to decline a full scholarship to MIT because they can't afford housing." "That's tragic," Thornton said, though his tone suggested he didn't see the relevance. "But it's not our responsibility to." "His daughter," Anderson interrupted, his voice harder now, solved in 4 hours what our $30 million team of PhDs couldn't solve in 8 weeks. She didn't just fix the processor. She revolutionized our understanding of quantum error correction by applying it to the EM shielding layer, something none of us had thought of. Dr. Kim, you've seen the data. Tell me I'm wrong. Dr. Kim looked up from the papers, her expression troubled. You're not wrong. The auxiliary buffer system it's elegant. It's innovative. It's exactly the kind of thinking we should have been doing. She deserves every penny of that $100 million, Anderson said. And her father deserved credit and compensation we never gave him. This isn't about a reckless bet. This is about a debt we owe. The moral argument hung in the air, beautiful and impractical. Victoria's expression hadn't changed. Anderson, I understand the emotional appeal. But this board has fiduciary responsibilities. We can't make decisions based on sentiment. If you pay $100 million based on an emotional promise, Robert Thornton added, you're signaling to every investor and analyst that Blake Quantum Technologies makes decisions based on feelings rather than business sense. Our stock will tank. Shareholders will sue. And frankly, Anderson, I'll call for a vote of no confidence. Victoria nodded slowly. Robert's right. If you insist on this, I'll have no choice but to put your leadership to a vote. And I think you'll find that several members of this board believe you've lost perspective. She paused, letting the threat sink in. I have the votes, Anderson. Thornton, the institutional investors, probably Whitmore. You'll lose your position as CEO. Is your integrity worth your company? The standoff crystallized into something sharp and dangerous. Anderson could see it playing out. The vote, the removal, the media firestorm. He'd fight, of course. He might even win. He still had allies, still had leverage. But it would tear Blake Quantum Technologies apart from the inside. The company he'd built would become a battlefield. Or he could back down. Accept the settlement. Keep his position. Betray his word and betray Marcus Walker's memory. You're asking me to choose between my company and my integrity, Anderson said quietly. I'm asking you to choose reality over sentiment, Victoria replied, her voice not unkind. To make the hard choice that protects this company and everyone who depends on it. Dr. Sarah Kim had been quiet throughout this exchange, but now she cleared her throat. Victoria, may I see those papers? Victoria slid the Marcus Walker papers down the table. Dr. Kim spread them out, pulling up references on her tablet, cross-checking citations. The room waited. When she finally looked up, her expression was grave. These papers are brilliant, she said. Walker's work on quantum error correction was foundational. We didn't just cite him, we built our entire coherent stability protocol on his theoretical framework. She pulled up something on her tablet, turned it so the board could see. We referenced his work in Patent 7,442,891. And Patent 8,903,445. And 4 others. His name appears in the prior art sections, but we never paid licensing fees because his research was published in academic journals. Academic publications are public domain, Thornton objected. We don't owe. Technically true, Dr. Kim interrupted. But if Marcus Walker's estate decided to argue that our patents weren't sufficiently transformative, that we merely implemented his theoretical work without substantial innovation, they could sue for royalties. Given how foundational his work was, they'd have a strong case. We could be looking at millions in back royalties, possibly tens of millions. The calculation in the room shifted. This wasn't sentiment anymore. This was legal exposure. James Whitmore leaned forward. From the Pentagon's perspective, this changes things. Colonel Martinez asked me specifically about the optics of the breakthrough. If we honor the commitment, frame it as recognizing and compensating overlooked genius that shows integrity. That's a company the DoD wants to partner with. But if we fight it, if we use legal technicalities to avoid paying. He shook his head. That's a company that cuts corners. That's not who we want handling classified quantum computing contracts. Patricia, the CFO, was already running new numbers on her laptop. If we structure this as a technology licensing payment to the Marcus Walker estate, with Jasmine as administrator, it's entirely defensible. We're retroactively licensing work we should have licensed years ago. Tax advantages are actually better than a straight consulting fee. We avoid potential future litigation. And the optics shift from CEO makes reckless bet to company corrects historical oversight and invests in generational talent. Victoria Chun studied the faces around the table. She was a pragmatist who'd made her fortune by making smart bets, and she could see the calculation shifting in real time. This doesn't set a precedent for emotional decision-making, she said carefully, as much to herself as to the others. This is correcting an oversight in our licensing agreements. We should have acknowledged Marcus Walker's contributions years ago. Anderson recognized what she was doing, giving herself and the board a face-saving narrative. He didn't care about the spin. He just cared about the outcome. Exactly, he said. We're simply paying what we should have paid all along. Victoria looked around the table. All in favor of a $100 million payment to the Walker family, structured as technology licensing fees and consulting compensation? Dr. Sarah Kim's hand rose first, without hesitation. Then James Whitmore. Patricia Sellers. The institutional investors exchanged glances, then raised their hands together. If the legal and Pentagon angles were covered, they had no objection. Robert Thornton sat with his arms crossed for a long moment, clearly unhappy. But finally, grudgingly, his hand rose. Victoria Chun was the last. Her hand came up slowly, deliberately. Motion carries. The next 40 minutes were spent negotiating terms. Patricia pulled up spreadsheets. The institutional investors asked questions about disbursement schedules and tax implications. Gradually, a structure emerged. $100 million paid over 2 years for tax optimization, structured as licensing fees for Marcus Walker's prior theoretical work and consulting fees for Jasmine's ongoing contributions. Jasmine would be brought on as a junior quantum consultant at $200,000 annually, working part-time while attending MIT. Denise would be promoted to Executive Services Manager at $90,000 annually, overseeing all facility operations across 3 locations. Full benefits package for both. College fund for Jasmine covering all expenses. And Dr. Kim insisted on this. Marcus Walker would be posthumously credited in all future Blake Quantum Technologies patents that built on his work. One more thing, Victoria said. NDA. The public story is talent recruitment and historical licensing correction. Not Billionaire makes insane bet and gets called on it. Agreed. Anderson nodded. It was a small price to pay. The meeting adjourned at 4:30 p.m. Board members filed out, some looking relieved, others still skeptical. Dr. Kim paused by Anderson's chair. You did the right thing, she said quietly. Marcus Walker deserved recognition. His daughter deserves opportunity. This is what science should be about. As the room emptied, Victoria Chun remained seated. She waited until the door closed, until it was just the two of them in the cathedral-like space. You nearly lost everything today, she said, her voice softer than it had been during the meeting. I know. You would have. If Sarah hadn't found the legal angle with the patents, if Whitmore hadn't backed you on the Pentagon perspective, I would have called that vote. And you would have lost. I know, Anderson said again. But I would have lost more if I'd betrayed my word. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Then she said, Harold would have been proud of you. Anderson's head snapped up. What? Harold Chun. My uncle. Victoria's expression softened into something almost like warmth. He was my mother's brother. He told me about you years ago. About the scrappy MIT kid with the brilliant idea and the decent heart. He said he invested in you not because of your business plan, but because you reminded him of himself, hungry but not cruel. Ambitious but not ruthless. He said, I'm betting on the man he is now. I hope he doesn't lose himself on the way up. Anderson felt his throat tighten. I broke that promise. Yes, you did. For a while. Victoria stood, gathering her papers. But you fought to keep it today. You chose integrity over convenience. That's not easy, especially not for someone like you, someone who built everything from nothing. It would have been so easy to take the settlement, protect yourself, and move on. Why didn't you tell me? Anderson asked. That you were Harold's niece. Because I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become without him watching. And for a while. She shook her head. For a while, I was disappointed. But today, you reminded me of the person my uncle believed in. She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the handle. Welcome back, Anderson. We missed the man Harold saw in you. The door closed softly behind her. Anderson sat alone in the empty boardroom, surrounded by the evidence of the battle he'd just fought, papers scattered across the granite table, coffee cups abandoned, the faint echo of raised voices still hanging in the air. He had won, but only barely. And only because the right people had been in the room at the right time. He thought about Harold Chun, dead these 5 years, whose investment had made everything possible. Whose faith had given a 23-year-old kid a chance. Whose niece had just orchestrated one of the most difficult board meetings of Anderson's career, not to destroy him, but to test him. To see if the man Harold had believed in was still in there somewhere, beneath the wealth and arrogance and cruelty. Anderson pulled out his phone and sent a text to his assistant. Schedule meeting with Denise and Jasmine Walker tomorrow, 9 a.m. My office. Make sure they know it's good news. Then he sat back in his chair and exhaled, feeling something release in his chest, tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He had made a choice. He had chosen who he wanted to be. Now he just had to figure out how to live up to it. At 4:30 p.m., Anderson Blake sat in his empty office and stared at his phone for a full minute before picking it up. His hands, which had signed billion-dollar contracts without trembling, shook slightly as he scrolled through his contacts to find the number his assistant had compiled that morning. Denise Walker's cell phone. A number he'd never had reason to know before yesterday. He dialed. It rang 4 times before she answered, her voice cautious and thin. Hello. Mrs. Walker, this is Anderson Blake. He heard her sharp intake of breath, the rustle of movement. I'm calling to ask if you and Jasmine could come to my office tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. There was a long silence. When Denise finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Blake, if this is about legal action, I need to tell you that we can't afford. It's not legal action, Anderson interrupted gently. It's good news. I promise you, Mrs. Walker. Good news. Can you come at 9? Another silence. Longer this time. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel the terror radiating through the phone line. She thought he was lying. She thought this was a trap. Why wouldn't she? Rich men didn't call janitors with good news. Yes, she finally said. We'll be there. Thank you. And Mrs. Walker. Anderson paused. I meant what I said. It's good news. He ended the call and sat back in his chair, looking out at Boston Harbor as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Tomorrow morning, he would either prove he was the man Harold Chun had believed in, or he would prove he'd learned nothing at all. There was no middle ground left. The Walker apartment in Dorchester was a modest 2-bedroom in a building that had seen better decades. The heating was inconsistent, the hallway smelled of cooking oil and old carpet, and the elevator had been broken for 3 months. But it was home, and it was what Denise could afford on a janitor's salary. She sat at the small kitchen table at 6 a.m., unable to sleep, staring at the stack of medical bills she kept in a manila folder. Even after Marcus's life insurance had been exhausted, even after 2 years of making minimum payments, she still owed $47,000 to various hospitals, specialists, and collection agencies. The bills were her constant companion, her reminder of everything the accident had taken and everything she couldn't provide. Jasmine's books were stacked everywhere, on the coffee table, on the kitchen counter, on the floor by the couch. Physics textbooks, mathematics journals, her father's old notebooks filled with equations and margin notes. Their small apartment was a shrine to Marcus Walker's intellectual legacy and his daughter's determination to honor it. On the mantel above the non-functional fireplace sat Marcus's photo, him at 38, smiling at the camera with that slightly distracted look he got when he was thinking about quantum mechanics while pretending to focus on family pictures. Denise looked at that photo now and whispered, I don't know what to do, Marcus. I don't know if I should trust him. He'll honor it, Mom. Denise turned to find Jasmine in the doorway, already dressed in her St. Catherine's Academy uniform. Her daughter looked impossibly calm, impossibly certain. You don't know that, Denise said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. Rich men like Anderson Blake don't honor bets to people like us. They find ways out. Legal ways. We could show up and find lawyers waiting to make us sign NDAs, to threaten us if we talk. He'll honor it, Jasmine repeated, moving to sit beside her mother. Because he has to. Not legally. Legally he could probably get out of it. But morally. He froze that night because he saw himself clearly for the first time in years. People don't come back from that moment unchanged. How do you know? Denise asked. Jasmine picked up her father's photo from the mantel, held it gently. Because Dad taught me that observation changes reality. Anderson Blake observed himself, really observed himself, and realized he didn't like what he saw. The universe doesn't let you unsee that. You either change, or you become someone you can't live with. She set the photo down carefully. He'll honor it because the alternative is becoming a man he can't stand to be. Denise wanted to believe her daughter's faith, wanted to believe in the physics metaphors Marcus had loved. But she'd been a janitor for 2 years, been invisible and overlooked and occasionally mocked. She knew how little powerful men thought of people like her. We'll find out in 3 hours, she said quietly. At 8:55 a.m., Denise and Jasmine Walker stood in the lobby of Blake Quantum Technologies, feeling like imposters in a world they didn't belong to. Denise wore her best clothes, a navy dress she bought 6 years ago for job interviews and hadn't needed since, paired with shoes that pinched her feet but looked professional. The dress was worn at the seams, slightly faded, but it was the best she had. Jasmine wore her school uniform, the same one she'd been wearing 2 nights ago. It was Friday, she'd miss her morning classes for this meeting, whatever this meeting turned out to be. The lobby was all glass and steel and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than their monthly rent. Young tech workers in expensive casual clothes moved through the space with the confidence of people who belonged. Denise and Jasmine stood out like a wrong note in a symphony. A security guard approached, not the same one who'd seen Denise cleaning late at night, but one of the day shift professionals who'd never noticed her before. Mrs. Walker? Miss Walker? Mr. Blake is expecting you. Please follow me. He led them to a private elevator, not the service elevator Denise used to take cleaning supplies between floors, but the executive elevator with its polished mirrors and soft lighting. As the doors closed and the elevator began to rise, Denise caught their reflection. A worn-out janitor and her teenage daughter, ascending to the 40th floor for the first time in their lives. They'd never been above ground level before. Denise's world was basements and back rooms, service corridors and utility closets. The upper floors might as well have been another planet. As they walked through the executive corridor, whispers followed them. Employees recognized Jasmine. Word had spread fast in a company this size. That's her. The genius kid. She's the one who fixed the processor. The whispers were curious, respectful, occasionally odd. No one looked at Denise. They never did. Anderson Blake's office was a corner suite with windows that seemed to capture all of Boston Harbor. The morning sun streamed through, catching on the water below, making the whole space glow. The furniture was elegant but not ostentatious. A massive desk made of reclaimed wood, a conference table that could seat 8, leather chairs that looked like they cost more than a car. Anderson stood as they entered. This simple gesture, standing for a janitor and her daughter, felt monumental. Denise couldn't remember the last time someone with power had stood for her. Mrs. Walker. Jasmine. Thank you for coming. He gestured to the conference table, not to the chairs across from his desk. An equal meeting space, not a power dynamic. Please sit. Can I offer you coffee? Water? We have pastries. We're fine, thank you, Denise said automatically, her voice tight with anxiety. Jasmine's hand found hers under the table, squeezed gently. Anderson sat across from them, and for a moment, he just looked at them. Really looked, in a way Denise wasn't used to being seen. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet and carried the weight of something that sounded like genuine remorse. Mrs. Walker, Jasmine, before we discuss anything else, I owe you an apology. A real one, not a corporate one. He took a breath. What I did 2 nights ago was cruel. Inexcusable. I used your mother to humiliate my team, to make a point about their failure. I turned her pain and her work into theater for my own ego. Denise stared at him, unable to process what she was hearing. Billionaires didn't apologize. They certainly didn't apologize to janitors. I mocked your courage, Jasmine, when I should have been grateful for it. I made a bet designed to underscore your powerlessness, never imagining you'd actually accept it. Never imagining you'd actually solve the problem. He looked directly at Jasmine. You saved my company. You revolutionized our approach to quantum computing. And my first response was to freeze like a coward because you'd shattered every comfortable assumption I'd built my life around. He paused, his jaw tight. I'm sorry. Truly. What I did to both of you was wrong, and I have no excuse for it except that I'd become someone I shouldn't be. Someone cruel. Someone who'd forgotten that people aren't props in my personal drama. The apology hung in the air. Denise felt tears prick her eyes but refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough in the last 2 years. She wouldn't cry in front of Anderson Blake. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice hoarse. Anderson opened a folder on the table and slid it toward Denise. Inside were academic papers. She recognized Marcus's name on every one, recognized his handwriting in the margins where he'd made notes. Your husband's work, Mrs. Walker, was foundational to everything we built here. Anderson's voice was gentle now, respectful. These papers, 6 of them, are cited in our quantum error correction patents. Dr. Chun built our coherent stability protocols directly from Marcus's theoretical framework. We made billions from his ideas. He pulled out another document, this one showing patent citations. He should have been compensated. He should have been credited properly, brought in as a consultant, given royalties. Instead, we took his work, publicly published academic research, and built a fortune on it while he... Anderson trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. While he taught high school physics to kids whose parents couldn't afford SAT prep courses, Denise finished softly. While he came home every day exhausted and fulfilled, talking about some student who finally understood quantum entanglement, who finally saw the beauty in it. He chose meaning over money, Anderson said. That's a choice I never understood until 2 nights ago. That's a debt I can never fully repay. But I can start trying. He slid a formal contract across the table. Denise stared at it, at the numbers that seemed too large to be real. $100 million. Structured as technology licensing fees for Marcus's prior work and consulting fees for Jasmine's contributions. Paid over 2 years. Legal language that made it real and binding and impossible to take back. This is... Denise couldn't find words. The numbers swam on the page. $100 million. It was more money than she'd earn in 10 lifetimes. More money than she could conceptualize. It was freedom. It was security. It was Marcus's legacy finally recognized. It's what we owe you, Anderson said simply. What we should have paid years ago. He turned to Jasmine. We'd also like to offer you a position. Junior quantum consultant, $200,000 annually. You'd work part-time, after school, weekends if you want, but only when you want. No pressure. Dr. Chun wants to mentor you, teach you everything he knows. We'll support your MIT education fully. Tuition, housing, books, living expenses, everything. But Jasmine. He leaned forward. You're 16. You should also be a kid. Go to prom. Hang out with friends. Have a life that isn't just physics. This job is here when and if you want it, but it's not an obligation. Jasmine nodded slowly, processing. Denise saw her daughter's hands trembling slightly, the first sign of the pressure she'd been carrying with such apparent calm. Anderson turned back to Denise. Mrs. Walker, our records show you were pursuing an MBA when Marcus died. You had to drop out. Denise blinked, surprised he knew that. Yes. I was 3 semesters in. I couldn't afford to continue after the accident. We need an executive services manager. Someone to oversee all our facility operations across 3 locations, not just cleaning staff, but security, maintenance, logistics, vendor management. It's a leadership position, $90,000 annually, full benefits, executive health plan. I'm not offering this as charity. I'm offering it because you're qualified, because you have the education and the organizational skills, and because we need good leadership. Someone who sees the people everyone else walks past. Denise's mind reeled. From janitor to executive. From invisible to essential. From $32,000 a year to $90,000. From no benefits to an executive health plan. The executive health plan, Anderson continued, sliding another document across the table, covers all outstanding medical debt retroactively. Every bill you've been carrying from the accident, it's part of the benefits package. Consider it a signing bonus. That's when Denise broke. The tears she'd been holding back for 2 years, through the accident and the funeral and the crushing debt and the double shifts and the humiliation of cleaning floors while holding an unfinished MBA, finally came. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, not quietly, not gracefully, but with the raw sound of someone who'd been holding on too long and could finally let go. Jasmine wrapped her arms around her mother, her own eyes bright with tears. Anderson quietly pushed a box of tissues across the table and looked away, giving them privacy in their moment of overwhelming relief. When Denise could finally speak again, her voice was thick and broken. "Thank you. God. Thank you." "There's one more thing," Anderson said gently. "With your permission, we'd like to establish the Marcus Walker Fellowship. An annual $50,000 scholarship for physics students from underserved communities, kids who have Marcus's brilliance but not his opportunities. The company will fund it. Jasmine can help administer it when she's ready, if she wants. Your husband's name should inspire the next generation of physicists. His legacy should be more than just patent citations." Jasmine had been mostly quiet, absorbing everything, but now she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "Mr. Blake, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why did you freeze that night? After the processor worked?" It was the question everyone had been asking, the moment that had defined everything that came after. Anderson was quiet for a long moment, considering how to answer honestly. "Because I realized everything I believed about success, intelligence, and worth was wrong," he said finally. "I'd built a $12 billion empire on the belief that credentials mattered most. That PhDs and pedigrees were the measure of capability. That I deserved my success because I was smarter and worked harder than everyone else. And you, without any of that, without any of the markers I'd used to define excellence, you were better than all of us. You solved in 4 hours what we couldn't solve in 8 weeks." He leaned back in his chair, his expression raw. "I froze because I didn't know who I was anymore. If everything I believed was a lie, if all my assumptions about merit and worth were wrong, then who was I? What did my empire mean? I'd become someone cruel and arrogant, someone who mocked people to feel powerful. And I didn't recognize that person. I didn't want to be that person anymore. But I didn't know how to be anyone else." The honesty in his voice was palpable, painful. This wasn't a corporate speech or carefully crafted PR. This was confession. "The board wanted me to fight this," Anderson continued. "My lawyers said I could win. You're a minor, the contract wasn't binding. We could offer a settlement, make you sign an NDA, spin the story however we wanted. Legally, I would have won. But..." He looked at Marcus's papers spread across the table. "I would have lost myself. Your father's work taught me something beyond quantum mechanics. He chose meaning over money, impact over wealth, teaching over prestige. That night, I had to choose what kind of man I wanted to be. Did I want to be the person who kept his word and honored your father's legacy? Or did I want to be the person who used power and lawyers to protect himself?" He met Jasmine's eyes. "I chose to honor my word and honor your father's memory. Because the alternative was becoming someone I couldn't live with." Denise had been mostly silent, overwhelmed by the contracts and the money and the transformation of their lives happening in real time. But now she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Marcus always said quantum mechanics taught him that observation changes reality. That the act of seeing something changes what it is." She looked at Anderson with something that might have been compassion. "I think you observing yourself clearly changed you, Mr. Blake. You saw who you'd become, and that observation collapsed the wave function. You became something different." Anderson nodded slowly, feeling the truth of her words. "Your husband was a wiser man than I am." "He was," Denise agreed simply. "But he also believed people could change. That's why he taught. That's why he chose teenagers who everyone else had written off. He believed in second chances." The contracts were signed with shaking hands, Denise first, barely able to hold the pen. Jasmine signed with her mother's co-signature as guardian, her signature surprisingly steady. Anderson signed last, his own hand trembling slightly, making the commitment irrevocable. "Welcome to Blake Quantum Technologies," Anderson said, standing and extending his hand. "Officially this time." They shook hands, first Denise, then Jasmine. The gesture felt ceremonial, weighted with meaning beyond a simple business transaction. As they moved toward the door, Jasmine suddenly turned back. "Mr. Blake." "Yes." "My dad would have liked you. After." Anderson frowned slightly. "After." "After you became real," Jasmine said simply. "Before you were just playing a part, the billionaire, the CEO, the genius. But that night, when you froze, you became real. You became human. That's when Dad would have liked you." The door closed softly behind them. Anderson stood alone in his office, looking at the signed contracts spread across his conference table. The numbers were enormous. The commitment was irrevocable. The implications would ripple through his company and his life in ways he couldn't yet predict. But for the first time in years, maybe for the first time since Harold Chun had believed in him, Anderson Blake felt something unexpected, something he'd almost forgotten: peace. Not the peace of success or wealth or power. The peace of knowing he'd done the right thing, even when it was hard. Even when it cost him something. The peace of becoming someone he could finally respect. He picked up Marcus Walker's photo from a folder, looked at the face of a man who'd chosen meaning over money, who died too young but left a legacy that would echo for generations. "Thank you," Anderson said softly to the photograph. "For teaching her well. For showing me what I'd forgotten." He set the photo down gently and turned to face the window, looking out at Boston Harbor where the morning sun painted everything in gold. A new chapter was beginning. Not just for Jasmine and Denise Walker, but for Anderson Blake himself. And for the first time in a very long time, he was ready for it. 3 months after Jasmine Walker fixed the impossible, Blake Quantum Technologies looked the same from the outside. Same gleaming building in Boston's Innovation District, same logo, same address. But inside, everything had changed. The Atlas quantum processor operated flawlessly, running 24 hours a day with 99.8% coherent stability. The Pentagon contract had been signed in a ceremony attended by Colonel Sarah Martinez herself, who'd shaken Anderson's hand and said quietly, "You made the right choice." $5 billion over 5 years, the largest defense contract in the company's history. The stock had climbed 23% in 3 months, analysts citing breakthrough technology and innovative talent acquisition strategy. The quarterly earnings call had been Anderson's smoothest in years. But those weren't the changes that mattered. Every Saturday at 9 a.m., Jasmine Walker arrived at the lab. She'd take the executive elevator now. Security knew her by name, greeted her with genuine warmth rather than suspicion. She'd work until 3 p.m., leaving time for homework and the remnants of a normal teenage life. But those 6 hours every Saturday had become legendary within the company. The engineers had been resentful at first. Dr. Marcus Hoffman, who'd objected so strenuously to her quantum buffer solution, had complained to Dr. Chun, "Are we really taking diagnostic advice from a high school student?" But that lasted exactly 2 Saturdays, until Jasmine solved a thermal distribution problem that had been plaguing their secondary processor for weeks. The supercooling isn't evenly distributed, she'd observed, studying the thermal imaging. You're treating it like a closed system, but quantum processors breathe. They exchange energy with their environment in microseconds. You need dynamic cooling that responds to quantum state changes, not static cooling that just maintains temperature. Hoffman had stared at her, then at his team, then back at her. "That's actually brilliant. How did you see that?" "Because I wasn't assuming the textbook solution was the only solution," Jasmine had replied simply. After that, the engineers stopped resenting her and started protecting her. When a journalist tried to ambush her in the lobby, 3 PhD candidates formed a human shield until security arrived. When she mentioned struggling with a calculus concept in AP class, Dr. Chun personally tutored her. The lab had adopted her as their own, not despite her age, but because of her mind. By month 3, she'd solved 2 more impossible problems. Dr. Chun had started calling her the assumption assassin, because her superpower wasn't just intelligence, it was the ability to question premises everyone else took for granted. "Why do we assume quantum states must be binary?" she'd asked during one meeting, and that simple question had sparked 3 weeks of productive research into tertiary quantum computing that might revolutionize the field. The culture shift rippled outward from Jasmine like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Anderson found his leadership style changing without consciously deciding to change it. He'd always run meetings from the head of the table, dispensing decisions from on high. Now he sat in the middle, soliciting opinions from junior engineers whose names he'd never bothered to learn before. The Jasmine Principle, he'd started calling it in leadership meetings, listened to unconventional voices, especially the ones you're tempted to dismiss. It became company policy. Every major project review now required input from at least one person outside the core team, a janitor, a security guard, and in turn, anyone with fresh eyes. Hiring practices expanded. Anderson personally oversaw the creation of a new recruitment pipeline that targeted community colleges, coding boot camps, and universities that didn't typically appear in their candidate pool. In 3 months, they'd hired 3 new engineers from community colleges, all brilliant, all overlooked by companies that filtered resumes by pedigree rather than capability. One of them, Maria Santos from Bunker Hill Community College, solved a quantum entanglement stability problem in her 2nd week. "Nobody ever asked me if I had ideas before," she'd said, amazed. "At my last company, I was just the girl from the cheap school." "Not here," Anderson had replied. "Here, you're an engineer with ideas worth hearing." Denise Walker's transformation was equally dramatic. As executive services manager, she'd taken a department that was invisible and undervalued and turned it into a model of efficiency and dignity. She implemented new protocols that saved the company $2 million annually while simultaneously improving working conditions for the staff everyone else ignored. She knew every janitor by name, knew their stories, their families, their dreams. When she discovered that 3 of them were pursuing college degrees at night, she created a company education assistance program. When she learned that the security team was understaffed and overworked, she hired 2 additional guards and instituted better scheduling. But more than efficiency, Denise brought humanity. She treated people like they mattered because, to her, they did. She'd been invisible for too long to ever make someone else feel invisible. Anderson watched her work and learned. "She sees people I walked past for years," he admitted to Dr. Chun one day. "I was so focused on the brilliant minds that I forgot the brilliant minds might be pushing a mop cart." His executive team noticed the change. Anderson had become accessible in ways he'd never been before. He ate lunch in the cafeteria instead of his office. He learned the names of administrative assistants and asked about their families. When Denise pointed out that the company's parental leave policy excluded single parents who adopted children, he didn't argue, he changed the policy. "You're different," Victoria Chun had observed during a board meeting. "Softer, but in a way that makes you stronger." The Marcus Walker Fellowship launched on a crisp Saturday morning in October at MIT, where Marcus had briefly taught as an adjunct professor before moving to public school education. The ceremony was held in the physics department's main auditorium, and it was packed: students, faculty, journalists, and 10 recipients who couldn't quite believe their good fortune. Each recipient would receive $50,000 annually for 4 years, covering tuition, housing, books, and living expenses at any university they chose. The selection criteria weren't GPA or test scores. They were passion for physics and potential overlooked by traditional systems. Jasmine gave the keynote speech. At 17 now, she'd grown into her role as her father's legacy keeper with grace that belied her age. "My father taught me that elegance in science mirrors elegance in life," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Simplicity, honesty, purpose." He believed that the most beautiful equations were the ones anyone could understand if someone just took the time to explain them. He believed that genius existed everywhere, in every community, in every income bracket. The only thing that varied was opportunity. She paused, looking at the 10 recipients in the front row, kids from Boston, from Mississippi, from South Dakota and East LA, kids who looked like they couldn't believe this was real. "This fellowship isn't charity. It's correction. It's the opportunities my father should have had, that you should have had, that everyone deserves. You're not here because someone is doing you a favor. You're here because you're brilliant and because science needs your brilliance." The ovation lasted 3 minutes. Anderson, sitting in the back, found his eyes stinging with unexpected tears. Despite the NDA, the full story leaked within a month. A junior engineer had talked to a friend who talked to a journalist, and suddenly Teen Genius Saves Quantum Computing Company was everywhere. TechCrunch, Wired, The Wall Street Journal, even a segment on 60 Minutes. Anderson's PR team had been in full panic mode, but Anderson himself had shut down their crisis protocols. "We're going to tell the truth," he'd said simply. His CNBC interview had been surprisingly honest. When the anchor asked about the $100 million bet, Anderson hadn't spun it or deflected. I made a cruel bet designed to humiliate a woman who worked for me. Her teenage daughter called my bluff and solved a problem my elite team couldn't crack. Then I froze because I realized everything I believed about intelligence and worth was wrong. He'd looked directly at the camera. I almost ran from my word. I almost let lawyers find me and escape. I'm grateful I didn't, because honoring that commitment saved more than my company. It saved me. The interview went viral. Anderson Blake became an unexpected model for corporate ethics, not because he'd been virtuous, but because he'd been honest about his flaws and his redemption. Harvard Business School requested permission to write a case study. TED invited him to speak. Some people thought he was performing, that it was all PR. But those who knew him, Victoria, Dr. Chun, Denise, saw the difference. This wasn't performance. This was transformation. The Saturday conversations between Anderson and Jasmine had become routine. After she finished her work, they'd sit in his office or the observation room, and they'd talk about quantum mechanics, about life, about the questions that didn't have easy answers. He was ostensibly mentoring her, preparing her for MIT and beyond. But increasingly, he realized she was mentoring him right back, challenging assumptions he'd held for decades. "Why do you work so hard?" she'd asked him one Saturday, her question as casual as if she were asking about the weather. Anderson had started to answer with his usual response: the company, the contracts, the competition, but stopped. Why did he work so hard? He'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. He had wealth beyond measure, influence, legacy. So why did he still work 70-hour weeks? "I don't know," he'd admitted. "I've been working this hard for so long, I forgot there could be another way." "Maybe it's time to figure that out," Jasmine had suggested gently. "My dad always said the hardest quantum state to observe is your own." That conversation had led Anderson to therapy for the first time in his life. Dr. Rachel Simmons, a psychologist in Cambridge, had listened to his story and said, "You built your entire identity around achievement. Now you're discovering there might be more to life than that. That's terrifying and necessary." He'd reconnected with his younger sister Emma, from whom he'd been estranged for 8 years over a petty argument he could barely remember. He'd started dating, nothing serious yet, but the first genuine connection he'd felt with someone in 5 years. He'd attended Jasmine's school science fair and genuinely enjoyed watching high school students explain their projects. "You're becoming human," Denise had teased him one day, observing his transformation with affectionate amusement. "It's uncomfortable but good," he'd admitted, and they'd both laughed. 3 months in, Jasmine proposed her next big idea during a Saturday lab session. Dr. Chun had gathered the quantum team to discuss next-generation applications, and Jasmine had listened quietly for 30 minutes before speaking. "What if we made AI that thinks in quantum states?" she'd said. The room had gone quiet. Neural networks are binary, yes/no, on/off. But thinking isn't binary. It's probabilistic, contextual, fluid. What if we built neural networks that operated in quantum superposition? AI that could hold multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously until observation collapsed them into decision. Dr. Chen's eyes had gone wide. Quantum neural networks. It's theoretical, beyond current implementation. "Everything's theoretical until someone builds it," Jasmine had countered. Anderson, observing from the back of the room, had felt that familiar thrill of standing at the edge of something revolutionary. "How much do you need?" 6 months. A dedicated team. Maybe $10 million in equipment, Dr. Chun had estimated. "Done. Jasmine's co-lead with you. Make it happen." Not everyone was happy about the changes. Some board members grumbled that Anderson had gone soft. Competitors mocked Blake's bleeding heart phase in industry publications. Stock analysts questioned whether his social experiment was sustainable. The criticism came to a head at TechCon, the industry's largest annual conference. Anderson was on a panel about innovation when Richard Vance, CEO of Neural Dynamics and a longtime rival, took a shot. "Anderson's running a charity, not a company," Vance had said with a condescending smile. "Hiring people from community colleges, throwing money at feel-good fellowships. That's admirable philanthropy, but it's not competitive business strategy." Anderson had felt the old anger rise, the instinct to crush, to humiliate, to prove his dominance. But then he'd thought of Jasmine, of Harold Chun, of who he was trying to become. "You're right that I've changed," Anderson had replied calmly. I'm running a different kind of company now. But I'm not running a charity, I'm running a better company. My best innovation in 20 years came from a 16-year-old the system had overlooked. How many other Jasmines are we missing because we only fish in the same pond? How much potential are we wasting because we mistake credentials for capability? He'd stood, addressing not just Vance but the entire audience. Our productivity is up 34%. Our innovation rate has doubled. Employee satisfaction is the highest in company history. Our top talent retention is 97%. And our stock just hit an all-time high. So you tell me, Richard, who's running the charity, and who's running the better business? The audience had erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted almost a minute. The video went viral within hours. The sentiment in the industry was shifting. Anderson Blake wasn't a cautionary tale anymore. He was a model. 6 months after Jasmine had fixed the Atlas quantum processor, the data was undeniable. Every metric that mattered had improved dramatically. The Jasmine approach, questioning assumptions, listening to unconventional voices, valuing talent over pedigree, had become a Harvard Business School case study titled Quantum Leap: How Embracing Unexpected Genius Transformed Blake Technologies. One Saturday afternoon in late March, Anderson stood in the observation room watching Jasmine work with 3 PhD candidates from Stanford. She was teaching them her diagnostic method, how to look past the obvious, how to question fundamental assumptions, how to listen to what the machine was telling them. The PhDs were taking notes like students, asking questions with genuine humility. There was no mockery, no hierarchy, just collaborative discovery. The scene mirrored that first terrible night 6 months ago, but everything was different now. Anderson pulled out his phone and texted Victoria Chun, "Thank you for not letting me destroy this." Her reply came 30 seconds later, "Thank you for finding your way back." Harold would be proud. He put his phone away and watched Jasmine explain quantum entanglement using a metaphor about dancers who could feel each other's movements across infinite distance. The PhD candidates were nodding, understanding clicking into place. This was what Harold had meant all those years ago. The something beyond numbers. The something Anderson had lost and finally found again. He'd built a billion-dollar empire. He'd achieved everything he'd set out to achieve. But this, watching a 17-year-old girl teach brilliant adults to see the world differently, watching his company transform from a monument to his ego into something that actually mattered, this was the first thing he built that he was truly proud of. Anderson Blake smiled, turned away from the window, and went to join the conversation. He had questions of his own, and for the first time in decades, he was genuinely curious to hear the answers. The transformation wasn't complete. It would never be complete. But it was real, and it was his, and it was finally pointing him toward becoming someone worth being. 1 year to the day after Jasmine Walker had fixed the impossible, Blake Quantum Technologies transformed its innovation lab into something it had never been before, a place of genuine celebration rather than manufactured corporate triumph. The space glowed with warm light instead of its usual sterile brightness. Round tables replaced workstations, each decorated with centerpieces that incorporated quantum physics imagery, Schrödinger's cat, wave functions, entangled particles rendered in elegant simplicity. A stage had been erected where the Atlas quantum processor usually dominated, though the processor itself still hummed nearby, a silent witness to everything that had changed. The guest list told the story of transformation. Colonel Sarah Martinez represented the Pentagon, their $5 billion contract not just met but exceeded by 15%. Academic leaders from MIT, Harvard, and 3 community colleges mingled with the 10 Marcus Walker Fellowship recipients, young physicists whose lives had been changed by opportunity. Former janitors who now held management positions stood comfortably among PhD engineers, barriers dissolved by a year of intentional culture shift. Dr. Chen and his engineering team occupied a central table, laughing at some shared joke. Victoria Chun sat with a full board. Even Robert Thornton, who'd fought the $100 million payment, now had to admit the decision had been sound. And at a place of honor near the stage sat Professor Helena Martinez from MIT's Quantum Physics Department, a woman who'd known Marcus Walker and had stories to tell. But the center of gravity, the person everyone's eyes kept drifting toward, was Jasmine Walker. At 17, she'd graduated high school 6 months early and was already 3 months into her PhD program at MIT. Her first paper, co-authored with Dr. Chen and titled Auxiliary Quantum Buffers, Protection Layer Error Correction in Multi-State Systems, had been published in Nature Physics and was already being cited internationally. The physics community was buzzing about the Walker method, her approach to quantum error correction that had spawned an entirely new research direction. She sat beside her mother, both of them wearing elegant dresses that still looked slightly uncomfortable on bodies more accustomed to work clothes and school uniforms. But Denise Walker, now VP of Operations overseeing 300 employees across 5 facilities, carried herself with a confidence that had grown over 12 months of proving she deserved every opportunity she'd been given. She'd completed her MBA, classes paid by Blake Quantum Technologies, but earned through her own late nights and relentless determination. Women in Tech Leadership magazine had featured her in their Rising Stars issue, From Janitor to VP, How Denise Walker Changed the Culture of a Billion-Dollar Company. And beside her sat Michael Chun, no relation to Dr. Richard Chun or Victoria, a kind, quiet high school physics teacher she'd met at a Marcus Walker Fellowship event. Like Marcus, he'd chosen teaching over wealth. Like Marcus, he believed in planting seeds. Anderson Blake took the stage at 7 p.m., looking out at the assembled crowd with an expression that would have been unfamiliar to anyone who'd known him a year ago. Gone was the predatory arrogance, the hawk-like intensity. In its place was something softer but somehow stronger, the face of a man who'd been broken and rebuilt into something better. A year ago tonight, he began, his voice carrying through the transformed lab, I stood in this room as someone I'm not proud of. I was a billionaire who thought money meant wisdom, who thought credentials meant capability, who thought my success gave me the right to mock people I considered beneath me. The room was silent, listening. I humiliated a woman who worked for me. I made a cruel bet designed to underscore her powerlessness. And when her daughter, he gestured to Jasmine, accepted that bet and did the impossible, I froze. I literally could not speak or move, because in that moment, everything I believed about intelligence, worth, and merit shattered like glass. He paused, gathering himself. I learned that wisdom often lives where we're too arrogant to look. In a janitor's daughter who saw patterns our PhDs missed. In a dead physicist's papers we'd cited but never credited. And in our own capacity for change, the hardest thing to believe in, and the most necessary. Anderson looked directly at Jasmine and Denise. Thank you for teaching me that lesson. Thank you for not giving up on the possibility that I could become someone better. The applause was warm, genuine. This wasn't corporate theater. This was testimony. Which brings me to tonight's announcement, Anderson continued. The Marcus Walker Fellowship has been life-changing for 10 brilliant students. But 10 isn't enough. 10 is barely a beginning. He paused for effect. So I'm announcing a $500 million donation to establish the Walker Quantum Institute, a partnership between MIT, Bunker Hill Community College, Roxbury Community College, and North Shore Community College. Its mission is simple: find and nurture unconventional genius wherever it exists. The crowd erupted. Anderson raised his hand for quiet. Denise and Jasmine Walker will serve as co-chairs of the advisory board. The institute will provide full-ride scholarships, research opportunities, and mentorship for students from communities traditionally overlooked by the scientific establishment. It will be Marcus Walker's legacy, not just in name, but in spirit. The belief that genius exists everywhere. That the only thing that varies is opportunity. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. Denise was crying, gripping Jasmine's hand. Victoria Chun was smiling, rare for her, and even Robert Thornton was on his feet, clapping with what looked like genuine enthusiasm. Professor Helena Martinez took the stage next, a distinguished woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen decades of physics breakthroughs. She adjusted the microphone and spoke with the authority of someone who'd earned every word. I knew Marcus Walker, she began simply. He was a friend and a colleague. 20 years ago, I tried to recruit him to MIT. We offered him a research position, good salary, access to the best equipment in the world. He turned us down to teach at an underfunded Boston public school. She smiled at the memory. I thought he was crazy. I told him so. He just laughed and said, Helena, genius exists everywhere. Opportunity doesn't. I'd rather create opportunities than take them. He believed the most important work wasn't discovering new physics, it was teaching the next generation to see the universe clearly. Her expression became serious. His daughter proves his thesis. She learned quantum mechanics in a garage, from a father who chose meaning over money. And she solved a problem that defeated some of the most credentialed minds in the field. She looked at Anderson. Mr. Blake's transformation proves we can fix the system that overlooks people like Marcus and Jasmine. We can choose to see talent where we've been trained to overlook it. The applause was thunderous. The ceremony continued with updates on the Atlas quantum processor's legacy. 5 processors now operated globally, in Boston, London, Singapore, Tel Aviv, and Cape Town. Each powered revolutionary research, AI systems that thought in quantum probabilities, medical imaging that could detect cancer at the cellular level, climate models with unprecedented accuracy. And each processor bore a name: Atlas, the original, Walker, Franklin, Lovelace, Carver, scientists who'd been overlooked, undervalued, or erased from history during their lifetimes but whose contributions had changed the world. "We stand on shoulders we never acknowledged," Dr. Chen said during his remarks. "The Walker method taught us to look back and credit those we'd forgotten. And to look forward with humility, knowing that the next breakthrough might come from someone we're currently ignoring." Jasmine spoke last, approaching the microphone with the calm confidence of someone who'd grown comfortable being seen. Her speech was brief but devastatingly precise, every word chosen with the same care she applied to quantum equations. "My dad taught me that the universe speaks to those who listen. That observation changes reality. That we're all quantum systems, existing in superposition until the moment we choose who to become." She looked at Anderson, standing at the edge of the stage. Mr. Blake learned to listen, not just to machines, but to people. Not just to credentials, but to capability. That's the real quantum leap. Not the technology. The transformation. When we observe each other differently, when we see potential where we expected limitation, everything shifts. She paused, her next words carrying the weight of lived experience. "A year ago, I was invisible. My mom was invisible. My dad's work was uncredited. We existed in a superposition of potential and powerlessness." Mr. Blake's observation, his choice to see us clearly, collapsed that wave function. And what emerged was this. She gestured to the room, to the celebration, to the transformed company. Not just money or recognition, but proof that change is always possible. That we're never locked into who we've been. We can always become someone better. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes this time, and Jasmine had to wipe tears from her eyes as she left the stage. After the formal ceremony ended and the party shifted into mingling and conversation, Anderson found Jasmine on the observation balcony overlooking Boston Harbor. She stood alone, her father's old physics textbook in her hands, the same one that had been visible in her backpack that first night, now worn even softer by a year of constant reference. "He would have loved this," Jasmine said quietly, not turning around. She didn't need to. She'd heard Anderson's footsteps, recognized their pattern. The institute, the fellowships, the processors named for forgotten scientists. All of it. Anderson joined her at the railing. The city lights reflected off the dark water below, creating a second Boston made of shimmer and possibility. "I wish I could have met him." "You did," Jasmine said, finally turning to look at him. "Through me. Through his work. Through what you became. My dad used to say we're all entangled with everyone we learn from. He's entangled with you now through me. You never met him in linear time, but you met him in quantum time, in the space where ideas and influence transcend physical presence." It was the most Marcus Walker thing anyone had ever said to Anderson, and he felt his throat tighten. "Can I tell you something?" Anderson asked. "Something I've never admitted to anyone?" "Of course." "That night, when I froze, I was terrified. Not of losing money or facing the board. I was terrified of seeing myself clearly." He stared out at the harbor. "You held up a mirror, Jasmine. It showed me someone I didn't recognize. Someone cruel and arrogant and small. Someone who'd accomplished everything he'd set out to accomplish and still felt empty because accomplishment without meaning is just noise." He turned to face her. "I didn't know who I was anymore. If all my assumptions about merit and worth were wrong, if credentials didn't equal capability, if I'd been filtering out the exact voices I needed to hear, then what was I? What did my empire mean? I froze because I was staring into an abyss of my own making." Jasmine nodded, her understanding profound beyond her years. "And what did you find? In the abyss?" "A choice," Anderson said simply. "I could jump back to the familiar side, use lawyers and power to protect myself, prove I was right to be cruel. Or I could jump forward into the unknown, honor my word and become someone different. Someone I didn't know yet but hoped I could be. Do you regret it? Jasmine asked. All the changes? Sometimes becoming someone new means leaving someone else behind. Anderson considered the question carefully, watching the lights dance on the water. I regret who I was. I don't regret who I'm becoming. I built an empire, but I'd forgotten why. You reminded me that the point isn't the building, it's what you do with it once it's built. And who you become in the process. Jasmine reached into her bag and pulled out a worn journal, Marcus Walker's handwriting on the cover. My dad kept journals. I brought one tonight. There's an entry I wanted to share with you. She opened to a marked page and read aloud, her father's words finding voice through her. Today a student asked why I teach instead of joining a corporation. Good question. The honest answer, I'd rather plant seeds than count gold. One seed, if it falls in fertile soil, might become a forest. A forest creates oxygen, shelter, ecosystems, life supporting more life. Gold just sits there, inert. Beautiful but ultimately useless unless you transform it into something else. Maybe I'll never be rich. Maybe I'll die with nothing in the bank. But I'll be rich in what matters. Students who see the universe clearly, who carry forward the light of understanding, who plant their own seeds. That's the only wealth that compounds forever. Anderson's eyes were wet with tears he didn't try to hide. Marcus Walker had understood at 38 what had taken Anderson 48 years and a complete breakdown to learn. The insight felt simultaneously humbling and hopeful, proof that wisdom was real, that some people saw clearly from the start while others had to be dragged to understanding through crisis. I never properly thanked you, Anderson said, his voice rough with emotion. You saved my company. But more than that, you saved me. You gave me a reason to become someone better. Jasmine smiled, and in that smile Anderson saw both Marcus Walker's wisdom and her own hard-earned grace. You saved yourself. You just needed a reason to try. My dad used to say everyone needs a quantum moment, a moment where everything possible becomes actual, where the superposition collapses and you become definitively yourself. That night was yours. You could have collapsed into cruelty or into compassion. You chose compassion. That choice was yours, not mine. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Boston breathe beneath them. What's next for you? Anderson finally asked. MIT, obviously. But beyond that. Quantum consciousness, Jasmine said, her eyes lighting up with the same excitement he'd seen when she proposed quantum neural networks. What if thinking itself is quantum? What if consciousness operates in superposition, holding multiple contradictory thoughts simultaneously until observation forces decision? What if that's why change is possible? Because we're never definitively one thing. We're always a probability cloud of potential selves. That's either genius or madness, Anderson said, grinning. With quantum mechanics, it's usually both, Jasmine replied. And you? She asked. What's next for Anderson Blake? Scaling the fellowship globally. Finding 1,000 Jasmines. 1,000,000. Changing the equation of who gets opportunity. He looked at her seriously. The Walker Institute will outlive me. I'm putting it in my will, 50% of my estate. Your father's legacy will touch generations. That's too much, Jasmine started to protest. It's not enough, Anderson interrupted gently. It's never enough. But it's a start. It's planting seeds instead of counting gold. They returned to the party together, and Denise saw them coming, her daughter and the man who'd changed, walking side by side like colleagues, like friends. The sight made something in her chest unfold, a tension she'd carried for 2 years finally releasing. The Atlas quantum processor hummed in the background, perfect and stable, Jasmine's quantum buffer still working flawlessly after a year of continuous operation. Dr. Chun was explaining the Walker method to a cluster of visiting researchers. Former janitors mingled with PhD engineers, sharing stories and laughter. The barriers that had seemed so solid a year ago had dissolved like quantum foam, revealing the truth. They'd always been arbitrary. Human-made. Changeable. This was the new Blake Quantum Technologies. Not just a company. A community. Night fell over Boston as the party continued. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city transformed into a constellation of lights reflected on the harbor's dark water. Inside, celebration gave way to collaboration as physicists and engineers clustered around impromptu whiteboards, sketching out ideas, arguing good-naturedly about quantum theory. Anderson stood slightly apart, watching it all with something approaching contentment. He was part of the community now, not separate from it. Not above it. He thought about that frozen moment a year ago, paralyzed by truth, unable to move forward or back. How terrifying it had been. How necessary. Paralysis had become the first step toward movement. Falling apart had allowed rebuilding into something stronger. A young man approached hesitantly, couldn't have been more than 22, with nervous eyes and a community college logo on his badge. "Sir? Mr. Blake? I'm sorry to bother you, but I have an idea. It's probably stupid, but—" Anderson interrupted gently, with a warmth that would have shocked anyone who'd known him a year ago. "There are no stupid ideas here. Tell me." The young man, Carlos Rodriguez, his badge read, from Bunker Hill Community College, first in his family to work in tech, began explaining a concept for improving quantum entanglement stability using harmonic resonance principles. Anderson listened, really listened, asking questions, making suggestions, treating the idea with the seriousness it deserved. Across the room, Jasmine watched this exchange and smiled. The quantum leap was complete. 5 years later. The headlines wrote themselves. Dr. Jasmine Walker, 22, becomes youngest tenured professor in MIT history. Nobel Prize in Physics nominates Walker for revolutionary quantum consciousness theory. Denise Walker named COO of Blake Quantum Technologies. Architects global expansion. Walker Institute celebrates 5,000th scholar. We're just getting started. The numbers told part of the story. 5,000 students from overlooked communities given full-ride scholarships and mentorship. 12 had started their own companies. 43 held PhDs. One had discovered a treatment for a rare genetic disease. Another had solved a critical climate modeling problem that improved hurricane prediction accuracy by 40%. But the real story was harder to quantify. It was in the culture shift that rippled outward from Blake Quantum Technologies to other companies, other industries. In the Harvard Business School case studies and TED Talks about the Blake transformation. In the slow, grinding change to hiring practices and opportunity distribution that would take generations to fully realize but had undeniably begun. Anderson Blake, 53, was still CEO but a different kind of leader. Fortune magazine named him Most Admired CEO, not for wealth accumulation but for transforming corporate culture and proving that ethical leadership and business success aren't mutually exclusive. He gave the commencement speech at Bunker Hill Community College, standing before students who looked like Carlos Rodriguez and Maria Santos, and said simply, "Genius isn't rare. Opportunity is. You are the proof that when we expand who gets a chance, everyone wins." The Marcus Walker Memorial had become a pilgrimage site for physicists. At the Walker Institute's headquarters, a beautiful building in Cambridge with Marcus's photo prominently displayed, an entire wall was dedicated to the problems solved by fellowship recipients. Each year, during the anniversary ceremony, Jasmine placed the first equation on the wall, her solution to the Atlas quantum processor, the quantum buffer that had started everything. Next to it, Marcus's journal entry about planting seeds was engraved in bronze. The forest was growing. Late one night, Anderson Blake visited the original lab alone. The building was quiet, most employees gone home, just security and a few night owls still working. The Atlas quantum processor still ran, 5 years old now, still perfect. Jasmine's quantum buffer, that elegant solution born from a garage education and a father's wisdom, continued to protect the system with flawless precision. Anderson placed his hand on the processor's casing, feeling its steady hum, a heartbeat mechanical but somehow alive. A woman was mopping nearby, young, wearing headphones, lost in her own world. Anderson watched her for a moment, then approached. "Excuse me. I'm Anderson Blake." She looked up, startled, pulling out an earbud. "Oh, Mr. Blake. Sorry, I'll move." No. I just wanted to introduce myself. What's your name?" "Maria. Maria Santos." She looked confused about why the CEO was talking to her. "What are you studying, Maria?" "How did you?" She stopped, laughed nervously. "Biology. Pre-med. Working nights to pay for it." Would you like to meet our biomedical research team? We're doing quantum-enhanced imaging work. It's groundbreaking stuff. You might find it interesting. Maria stared at him like he'd started speaking another language. Why would you do that? Anderson smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine. Because someone taught me to see talent everywhere, not just in expected places. And because I was once too blind to see it. I'm trying not to be blind anymore. After Maria left, still looking bewildered, clutching a business card for Dr. Chen's assistant, Anderson stood alone with the Atlas quantum processor. His hand still rested on its casing, feeling the vibration of quantum states maintained in perfect superposition. He thought about everything quantum mechanics had taught him. Superposition. Entanglement. The observer effect. It had never been about the physics. It had always been about the metaphor. We're all in superposition, capable of being cruel or kind, closed or open, generous or grasping. We exist in a probability cloud of potential selves. And then something forces observation. A crisis. A choice. A 16-year-old girl saying, "My mom can't, but I can." That observation collapses the wave function. We become definitively ourselves. Not forever. Quantum systems can return to superposition, can change again. But in that moment of observation, we choose which version of ourselves becomes real. Anderson had chosen. And in choosing, he'd become someone he could finally respect. The security guard passed on his rounds. "Good night, Mr. Blake." "Good night, Henry." Anderson turned from the processor. "How's your daughter's college search going?" They talked for 5 minutes. Henry's daughter Sophia was choosing between 3 schools, all of which had offered her Walker Institute scholarships. She wanted to study engineering, maybe work here someday. Henry was so proud he could barely stand it. After Henry continued his rounds, Anderson looked out at Boston one last time. The city lights reflected on the harbor, creating infinite copies of themselves in the dark water, superposition made visible. He thought of that frozen moment a year ago. The paralysis that had felt like death, but had actually been transformation. The best thing that ever happened to him. Because in that suspended instant, everything changed. And the man who emerged was someone he could finally, genuinely, gratefully be. Wide shot, Boston skyline at night. Blake Quantum Technologies building lit up, a beacon among the city's constellation of lights. Inside, the Atlas quantum processor hums its perfect frequency, a janitor's daughter's elegant solution, still working flawlessly. A billionaire's transformation, ongoing. The quantum buffer absorbs fluctuations, sacrificing itself infinitesimally to protect the whole, over and over forever. And somewhere in the quantum foam of possibility, Marcus Walker's dream has become actual, seeds becoming forests. Gold transformed into something that actually matters. A legacy not of wealth hoarded, but of doors opened. Not of power concentrated, but of potential liberated. Not of genius gate-kept, but of genius recognized wherever it grows. The observer changed. Reality changed. The quantum leap was complete. The end.
Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If you found it enjoyable, you'll definitely appreciate the next one. It's even more captivating and full of surprises. Simply click the image on your screen to continue watching.